Okay, starting off by telling you about the plan today. So, first of all, I'm going to go through why you should listen to me. So, why you should listen to this advice, what Politics Explained is, and how we can help you in your A-level politics. We're then going to go into how to revise for A-level politics. So, some key advice on how not to revise and how to revise as you really look. I'm sure most of you are year 13s and you're really looking to revise all the way up into those exams. I'm then going to look at timings, which are really, really important, before going in detail into the essay questions. So these are the 30-mark essay questions for Edexcel and the 25-mark essay questions for AQA. We're going to look at essay planning, at introductions, main paragraphs, some key A-star tips, evaluation, and conclusions, and that's going to be a big bulk of the webinar. We're then going to look at source and extract questions, looking at the key advice for Edexcel source questions to start off with, though effectively I'd really watch that if you're doing AQA as well. We're then going to go into AQA specific questions. So looking at extracts, 25 markers and 9 markers. And if you do Edexcel, I'd recommend you take a kind of short break effectively during that section. I'll tell you how long it's likely to be. And then we're going to finish off by coming back and looking at Edexcel political ideas questions, those 24 markers and the 12 markers. So the idea is it's going to be really comprehensive and cover loads of key advice on essay writing for A-level politics. First of all, why should you listen to me then? I'm sure you're getting lots of advice from your teachers and lots of advice from different areas. As you'll see, the advice we've got is really, really detailed. We've got loads of examples here. There's a few reasons why I think you should listen to me. So I got an A-star in A-level politics myself, and in doing A-level politics, I realized that it's a really difficult A-level. I think a lot of people take the A-level thinking it's going to be easier than it is, but there's a huge amount of content, and it's not obvious exactly what the exam boards want you to do in terms of that essay writing technique. So that's kind of why I started Politics Explained 4 years ago. So I started whilst I was at university in Cambridge studying politics. I'm a massive nerd about politics. I love it. So I was kind of tutoring A-level politics for a while and then started Politics Explained with the aim of kind of making YouTube videos and resources to really help A-level politics students reach the best grades they can effectively. Second key point is that all of our advice is in line with the exam boards. I go to loads of exam board trainings for Edexcel and for AQA, the exact same ones that teachers go to. So the stuff I'm recommending today, I'm not going to be telling you something completely different than from what the exam boards are saying, and that's really, really important. I've tutored over 50 students in A-level politics myself, with the vast majority getting A's and A stars. And finally, as I said, I know how difficult A-level politics is, and really want to help as many students as possible to do well. And I did Edexcel myself when I did A-level politics, but I go to all the AQA trainings as well. Okay, before we get started and have a look at each revision, I just wanted to tell you about some of the other things we're running this year. So after this initial webinar, which we're focusing on exam technique and revision, I'm going to be running loads more webinars covering different parts of the A-level politics course for both Edexcel and AQA students over the Easter period. These are each really, really long. They're 5 to 7 hours. And they're designed to prepare you as effectively as possible within that time, effectively. So each webinar covers a major part of the course and includes hundreds of slides packed with key knowledge, examples, essay plans, A-star tips, and exam-ready conclusions. And when I started these webinars last year, the goal for me is always to make something better than anything out there and just to give you as much value as possible within the time. So every topic is going to be covered in these webinars, but extra focus is going to be given to the most likely topics to come up in 2026. And crucially, after purchasing these webinars, you can access and revise with the recordings all the way up until your final exam. So I'll tell you about the different webinars we're running in a second, but that's kind of effectively what they are. Last year, our Easter revision webinars received kind of only 5-star reviews and over 40 5-star reviews, including from people, for example, here who don't normally use paid revision and found them really, really useful. So I hope that many of you will kind of join us too, ask questions during the webinars and get as much out of them as possible. And then just to tell you the dates then. So Edexcel for this year, we're doing UK politics, core political ideas, UK government, feminism, nationalism, anarchism, US politics and government, and global politics. And these are all in Easter. So starting on the 30th of March, and then the US one is on the 11th of April, and the global one is on the 12th of April when they kind of finish off. And we're also doing 2 key AQA webinars this year. So doing government and politics of the UK, paper 1, and government and politics of the USA. And that first one's on the 28th of March, and the second one's on the 7th of April, effectively. And just because you've come to the free webinar, I thought I'd give you a a discount code effectively. So you can use the discount code webinar discount, all capitals, for 20% off the first paid webinar. So that's either Edexcel UK Politics if you do Edexcel or AQA Paper 1 webinar. And even if you're watching this recording after the webinars have happened, if you're watching it in April or May, the webinar recordings that will be available to purchase even after the webinars have happened to help you revise all the way up until the exam. So yeah, that's the other Easter revision webinars we're running this year. We've also got loads of other resources on our website to help you in A-level politics, including detailed essay plans and detailed revision notes. And these are updated to make sure they're kind of always ready for you to use for this year's exams. In fact, I'm doing a big update of the essay plans in the next week, effectively. Detailed example packs. These are key packs of recent examples from the past year of politics for you to use in UK politics, UK government, or US politics and government. And not only do they give you the examples, they give you some key explanations and how you can use them as points in your essays. And we've also got a place to sign up for tutoring if that's something you'd be interested in. Very soon, we're also bringing out some physical flashcards for A-level politics and some source question packs. So make sure to subscribe to the newsletter on the Politics Explained website, and I'll tell you when those are out as well. One final thing to tell you about before we get into the webinar and looking at how to revise for A-level politics is that we've recently launched History Explained, Geography Explained, and Sociology Explained. And for all of these, we're doing very similar to Politics Explained. So detailed essay plans to help you to revise effectively. And these are kind of detailed essay plans for the tutors for history, 20 marker plans for AQA A-level geography, and 30 marker plans for A-level sociology, and detailed revision notes for all of these as well. And we're also bringing out loads of free resources for these subjects as well. So detailed YouTube videos covering key parts of the content and social media content as well. So make sure to check those out as well. If you go to the Politics Explained website, you can find links to all three of these because I'm sure many of you will be doing history, sociology, or geography as well. Okay, starting off then with the webinar, we're going to look at how to revise for A-level politics. And the first key thing to go through for me is how not to revise. So I'm sure a lot of you are sitting down and really you've already pretty started your revision or already thinking about planning it up until this year's exams now. And there's a few things I'd avoid. First of all, don't just read through your notes or watch videos. So even the videos that I've made or these webinars, the webinars I'm going to be doing on the content, don't just kind of sit there and read through them or watch them. You really need to be revising actively, right? You need to be testing yourself. So if you're watching videos, you want to be kind of testing yourself throughout and doing practice questions and doing practice essay plans as well. It's not enough to just watch stuff because you need to be testing yourself to build that active recall in the brain effectively. The second key thing that is really easy to do, because revision is quite boring, to be honest, and revision is difficult, is that you kind of fall into the trap of just revising the things you're already good at, because that's a little bit easier. You really want to avoid that. To do well in A-level politics, you need to go into the exam being prepared for any topic from the specification that could come up. So you need to revise everything, including the topics that you really don't like. Thirdly, don't just revise without a plan. Don't go and just think, oh, okay, I'll revise this one day, this the next day. You really need to kind of come up with a little bit of a plan, or I'm going to give you a tracker effectively for free you can use to make sure that you cover everything in the lead up to the exams. Finally, don't cram in A-level politics. Some of you can do really well in GCSEs if you cram a couple of weeks before. There's just too much content in A-level politics. I've seen it so many times. Students who don't do much throughout the year, who don't start revising from now and just try and cram in the last 2 weeks. And it's very, very difficult to do. You need to make sure you're revising consistently up until the exams. And finally, don't over-revise. Don't try and revise 10 hours per day. I know that A-levels are very stressful and it can get to a point where you feel like, okay, I need to be revising loads and loads and loads. And don't get me wrong, I think you should be revising lots and you should be consistently be revising. But it gets to a point where, say you're doing revising A-level politics after school and you've already done 3 hours of revision or 2 hours of revision. That extra fourth or fifth hour, you're likely, it's not much is going to be going in and it's not going to be too helpful. So make sure you do look after your mental health as well. I think it's really, really important. And it gets to a point where you can over revise as well. So give yourself a clear plan and make sure you're revising a good few hours a week, but don't kind of spend your whole life revising. I think is really, really important. How then should you revise? And the first key way for me is essay plans, essay plans, essay plans. For me, essay plans are by far the best way to revise for A-level politics. And that's making essay plans and testing yourself with them. They're good for a number of ways. Firstly, they make sure that you're focusing on the content and arguments that are likely to come up in the exams. If you're kind of really planning essays for key questions that could come up, you're going to make sure that you're really focusing on what you might be doing in the exam and what you might really need to be doing to get the grade that you want. So that you because there's so much in A-level politics, right? And if you read textbooks, there's so much out there that you can't just go and memorize everything effectively. What you want to do is kind of highlight some kind of key essay plans for every topic and memorize those. And that's what's going to help you work out, okay, what do I actually need to memorize for the exam? What key parts of this content do I actually need to memorize? And then they really help you in your revision. And crucially, every time you're planning an essay plan or testing yourself with an essay plan, you're doing what you're going to be doing in the exam. So you'll be, by the time then you've gone to the exam, you've got into the exam and you open the paper and look at a question, you would have planned loads and loads of different questions and have gone through that process. So you'll be really well prepared. So if you have a bank of detailed essay plans for every topic, you'll be well prepared for the exam. And crucially, you should know these plans well, but you could also use them to practice. You also want to make sure you practice using them to answer different, more difficult questions that could come up. You don't want to just go in with 20 plans for UK politics and only be able to answer questions on those plans. You also want to, once you've made those plans, test yourself with them, but also practice answering more specific or more difficult questions. And our essay plans on the Politics Explained website help you do exactly that with kind of questions at the bottom. The second key thing you want to use for revision is practice exam questions. I've been an A-level student, I've been a uni student as well, and it was the same. This is the most difficult thing to convince yourself to do in revision, is to sit down and write a full essay, or to sit down and write a full mock. But ultimately, it's the thing that makes the biggest difference if you're looking to kind of improve and get the grade you want to get, because you need to be really confident in your essay writing and your exam technique and your timings to do well in A-level politics. And I've seen it consistently with loads of students that we've tutored. The students who see the biggest improvements are those who practice essay writing in time conditions regularly throughout their A-level effectively. So if you're revising a topic, don't do these for the same question you just looked at an essay plan on. So I'm going to tell you kind of how you can revise each topic. Instead, try and practice writing essays for different questions so that you can kind of try and replicate that process of going into the exam, looking at a question you maybe haven't completely planned before, and being confident in answering. And a great way to do that as well is source questions. You want to be really prepared for those source or extract questions as well. Even more difficult than doing kind of practice essay questions in time conditions is doing multiple mock papers. But you do want to try and do a good few mock papers before your exam, because you can practice your timings for each question, but it's really difficult in an exam to write for 2 hours straight. You really need to have that practice of working out those timings and what works for you so that you go into the exam and it's not the first time or the second time, maybe you did it in year 12 mocks, that you're doing a full paper. If you go into the exam and you've done a good few mock papers in time conditions before, you're much less likely to be panicked effectively, and you're much more likely to be effective with your timings. So then, how should you revise? So this is how the key principle, I'll show you how you can do it in each topic in a second, but the key principle here is to start by testing yourself. What you don't want to do is, say you're going in to revise electoral systems. What you don't want to do is, before you immediately just start reading your notes or watching a video or going through stuff to understand. You want to, at the start, test yourself. So before you even start looking at any of the content, test yourself by trying to write out an essay, or to write out an essay plan, or to state some key advantages or disadvantages and examples that you know. And if you do that at the start, before you start revising, or at the start of your revision, that's going to really help you memorize effectively. Because if you just go in and you read over your notes straight away and then do essay plans, of course those essay plans are going to be good. Of course you're going to know them. But if you start by testing yourself and see what you know already, that's going to kind of build those connections in the brain and improve your memorization. And then you go and have a look at your revision resources to fill in the gaps, work out what you didn't know and how you could improve it. And then go and plan an essay after that. And if you do that every time you revise, it's really going to help in terms of your memorization, because there's so much you need to memorize before the exams. There's so much you need to know. And if you just read through stuff, that's not really going to help. So start by testing yourself. So you might want to do that by trying to write out a couple of essay plans, key essay plans for electoral systems, for example. Then go to your revision resources, whether that's your essay plans, revision notes, could be Politics Explains revision notes or essay plans if you haven't had time to make some yourself, and look at how you could have improved those essay plans you've done. So often doing it in a different colored pen is a great way to do it. So you work out what was missing, fill it out in a different colored pen, and then test yourself by writing a full essay or source question in timed conditions for a different question to the one that you would have revised at the start. So yeah, each time you revise a topic, find one or two essay questions for that topic and try and plan them in as much detail as you can at the start. So this could be for electoral systems. One of them could be evaluate the view that first past the post is the most effective electoral system currently in use in the United Kingdom, or a similar worded question for AQA. Because this is kind of quite a general question that kind of tests your key knowledge that you're really going to need to know. Then find out what the gaps in your knowledge were. So after you've tried that, then go back to your notes, videos, essay plans, or whatever it is, and go back to the plan you've just tried and fill in the gaps with what you were missing with a different colored pen. I'd then recommend the key things you didn't know. So some of those key things in that red pen that you didn't know, for example, you can put them into flashcards to test yourself with. And they may be some key recent examples that you didn't know, or a key point you didn't know, or you didn't know the right essay structure. So you can just put on one side, what is the key essay structure for first past the post, and put the other side, the answer. And then finish off by doing a practice essay or source question. And make sure this isn't for this question that you've just planned, because obviously you're then going to be able to do that effectively. But try and make it for a slightly differently worded question effectively. So say it's this one to evaluate the view that first past the post is the most effective electoral system in use in the UK. I might then, at the end of my revision, do a source question or do evaluate the view that first past the post should be scrapped. A slightly different question to force yourself to kind of adapt as you'll have to in the exam. A key thing I'd recommend in terms of managing your overall revision is using a revision tracker. This is what I've got a kind of completely free template on the Politics Explained website. You can go and get this revision tracker completely for free, effectively. And what this does is rather than it being a plan of like, okay, I've got 12, 10 weeks or whatever it is to revise, I'm going to plan what I do every day up until that revision. What this does is tracks your revision of different topics, which is really, really useful. So whenever you revise a topic, you effectively put in the date. Okay, so I've revised democracy or suffrage today, or I've revised referendums, and you color it with how effective you were at the topic, effectively. And then when you're planning your revision, you can kind of go to your revision tracker and see what you've revised so far, what you haven't revised yet, and therefore, okay, if I'm then going to pick what I'm going to revise next week, I'll pick things I haven't revised yet. Or once you've revised everything once, you'll then start with the things that are in red, the things you're worst at effectively. And what it means is you kind of make sure that you're revising everything and it's tracking your revision. And you also make sure you're not kind of neglecting the topics that you find most difficult. And you make sure, therefore, okay, if you revised everything 3 times up until the exam, you'll make sure you're really confident. So that's completely free. If you go to Politics Explained website, just the free resources section, you can download that and we'll email it to you completely free. And the final thing to have a look at is how I'd think about planning my revision each week effectively. So I'd start by working out how much time you have to revise A-level politics this week. And you want to make sure that it's realistic. So say, okay, I've got 6 or 8 hours to revise before this year's exams. For this week, effectively. Okay, I've got 6 or 8 hours for this week. I'd then look at my revision tracker and pick out the topics that I'm going to revise. So I pick out the topics that I revised the longest ago and the topics that I'm least confident at, effectively. And that's going to make sure that over time, you're going to revise everything and be confident in everything. I then go through that process we just covered. Start by testing yourself, by trying to write out a few essay plans. Then go and fill in the gaps using your notes or essay plans or Politics Explained resources, whatever it is. And then go and kind of test yourself by writing an essay or source question in time conditions. And kind of it's important to try, you may not do that for every topic you revise in every week, but at least kind of once or twice a week, you want to be doing that time practice. And then once you've finished, change its color on the revision tracker to show how well you know the topic. And this shouldn't just, obviously after you revised everything, you're going to be quite confident in it. So you should also consider kind of overall how effective you are at it. So if you started revising that topic and you knew nothing, you should probably cover it in red, because that will remind you when you next come to revising something in 3 weeks' time. And for example, when you've covered everything else, okay, I should go to that topic first because I really didn't know it very well. Okay, and then let's have a quick look at timings, and then we'll go into a quick Q&A. Timings are really, really important. This is why I really emphasize time practice, because ultimately you can be as prepared as you want, but if you run out of time in the exam, it will really harm you. So timings for AQA, for the 9 markers, if you don't have extra time, I'd aim to spend 13 to 15 minutes, so around 14 minutes on each 9 marker. And if you have extra time, 16 to 18 minutes. And then for the extract and the essay question in each paper, I'd recommend spending kind of 39 minutes on it, on each of them if you don't have extra time, or 49 minutes on it if you do have extra time. And this is assuming it's kind of 25% extra time. So 14 minutes on each of the 9 markers and 39 on the other 2 questions, extract and essay, if you don't have extra time, and 17 and 49 if you do have extra time. In terms of Edexcel, if you don't have extra time, I'd recommend spending around 42 or 43 minutes on each of the 30 markers, and then around 35 minutes on the 24 marker. So that's in paper 1 and paper 2. So 42-ish minutes on the essay question, 42-ish minutes on the source question, and then 35 on the 24 marker. If you do have extra time, around 52 minutes or 53 minutes on the source question and the essay question, and then around 44 minutes on the 24 marker. And then in terms of paper 3, for both of the essay questions, if you don't have extra time, I'd recommend, again, spending about 42 minutes, and then around 17 minutes on each 12 marker, each of the 12 markers effectively. If you do have extra time for paper 3, I'd recommend going for around 52 minutes on each of the 30 markers and around 22 minutes on each 12 marker. And this is effectively making sure that you give enough time to every question based on how many marks it is. And this is kind of broadly, so this is why you want to practice your timings up until the exam, because you might work out, okay, if you do AQA, you can do the 9 markers a bit quicker. Or if you do Edexcel, you personally might be able to do the 12 markers a little bit quicker, and that might save you some of the time on the essays. So this might be a little bit different for each student, but the only way you can work that out is through the timings. But overall, I'd try and stick to these guidelines effectively. I know I've been saying this already, but I can't emphasize enough how important it is to practice your timings. You can be as prepared as you want to go into the exam looking to get a guaranteed A star. But if you run out of time and only write half an answer for your final question, for example, it will make it very difficult to get the grade you want. So practice essays and mocks in time conditions. They're really, really important. Make sure you practice your timings. Okay, so what we're going to have a look at now is essay questions. These are the 30 markers for Edexcel and the 25 markers for AQA. So the first key thing to have a look at is essay structure. So you want in every kind of 30-mark essay for Edexcel or 25-mark essay for AQA you're doing, you want an introduction where you introduce the topic, how you're going to approach answering the question, and your overall answer to the question. You then want 3 main paragraphs. For Edexcel, I really would recommend doing 3 main paragraphs. If possible, the exam board have said that you're much more likely to do better if you do 3 compared to 2. If you practice it and absolutely have no time to revise 3 main paragraphs, then do 2 if you just can't finish with 3 main paragraphs, but ideally try and do 3. AQA are a little bit more lax on this, so you can do 2, but again, if you can get to 3, I'd recommend it. And in each of these 3 main paragraphs, you effectively want 2 sides of an argument and a mini conclusion. So you want to introduce a point, explain and analyze a point from one side of the argument and back it up with relevant knowledge and specific examples. You want to do for the other side of the argument, you want to counter it with the other side of the argument, again backing it up with knowledge and examples, and they should be matched up well, and we'll look at how to do that through essay planning in a second. And then at the end, you want a mini conclusion where you explain which side of the argument you find most persuasive and justify why, effectively. So you want introduction, then 3 of those main paragraphs covering different topics, and we'll have a look at how to plan in a second. And then finally, you want a conclusion. You want to end your essay by restating your answer to the question and really trying to kind of finally persuade the examiner of your judgment, effectively, of So stating that judgment in answer to the question and really trying to strongly justify it effectively. So this is the overall essay structure, but I'm sure you all know that relatively well already. And what we're going to look at now is essay planning. So planning is really, really important. Before you start writing your introduction, you should make sure you know the structure of your essay, what's going to be covered in your main paragraphs, and finally, your overall judgment in relation to the question. So this is the final part we're not going to cover as much, but we're going to have a look at how you can plan the different paragraphs. But you also want to make sure before you start writing, you need to know your answer to the question because your judgment needs to be consistent through your introduction, main paragraphs, and conclusion. And in terms of planning out, okay, your different paragraphs, there's 3 different ways you could do it. The first is trying to select 3 themes or criteria, which I'm sure you've heard your teacher talk about, and this should be your go-to. This should be what you should try and do. But sometimes that's too difficult, effectively, for the particular questions. So I'm going to give you a backup, effectively. If you can't think of 3 themes or criteria for the particular question that comes up in the exam, you can instead match up for and against points. So that's where you write down all the arguments you can think of on one side, all the arguments on another side of the paper, and then match them up into 3 paragraphs. And then finally, we're going to have a look at factors questions. These are a particular type of question that the Edexcel exam board want you to kind of use a particular structure for. So we'll have a look at those at the end. They're a little bit rarer, but you want to make sure that you kind of follow exam board advice for this. So as I mentioned, your go-to should be planning using themes or criteria. So you want to select 3 kind of themes for your 3 paragraphs, your 3 main paragraphs, that will allow you to develop a really justified answer to the question. So it might be 3 different ways to analyze or answer the question. We're going to look at some examples in a second. And they need to give you the ability to come to a justified conclusion. So they need to cover enough of the content and analyze it. If you analyze a question in 3 key different ways, that will give you a lot of material to then come to a really reasoned justification for why you've come to your argument. And they need to allow you to bring in different arguments rather than repeating yourself. So they need to be 3 really separate themes as well. To give you some examples then, so say it's the question, evaluate the view that devolution has been a failure, or AQA, devolution has been a failure, analyze and evaluate this statement. You might want to think about what are the 3 different ways we can judge the success of devolution. What would it look like if devolution had succeeded, and what would it look like if devolution had been a failure? These are the kind of questions you can ask yourself to try and come up with the 3 themes. And the 3 I'd go for here, with all of these aren't the only way you can answer these questions, but the 3 I'd go for is, has it improved democracy? Has it made the UK more unified? And has it improved policymaking? This is what I mean by themes or criteria. We're asking the question of, has devolution been a success or has it been a failure? And we're analysing it in 3 key different ways. And the idea is that if in these 3 paragraphs, we're judging it on democracy, we're judging it on whether it's made the UK more unified, and we're judging it on has it improved policymaking, we can then come to we've covered lots of different arguments, lots of different parts of the content, and we can come to a really effective judgment. You could instead do 1 paragraph, say, on Scotland, 1 paragraph on England, and 1 paragraph on Northern Ireland, for example. And though you could do well with that, the exam board really like themes effectively in Edexcel. And what you end up doing if you do 1 on each country, or if you do 1 on each election for voting behaviour questions, is repeating your arguments somewhat. Whereas here, you're going to have very key different arguments, because in democracy paragraph, they're going to be about whether devolution's been positive for democracy or negative for democracy. For the unity paragraph, they're going to be focused on unity for and against, and for policy making the same. So you really want to try and do themes if you can. To give you another example then, evaluate the view that first past the post should be scrapped and replaced with a more proportional electoral system. So looking at electoral systems and which is the most effective. Again, a slightly different question for AQA. First past the post should be scrapped and replaced with a more proportional electoral system. Analyse and evaluate the statements. They're differently phrased, but effectively the same question. So again, we can look at, okay, we're looking at whether first past the post should be scrapped and replaced. Therefore, we need 3 different ways to analyse, is first past the post good, or is first past the post good, bad, and comparing it with more proportional systems in use in the UK, effectively. So that's where I'd go for, okay, what are 3 key ways we can analyse electoral systems? Firstly, representation, how representative they are. Secondly, voter choice. And thirdly, the governments they create. Because we're going to have really key kind of specific arguments within those themes that will allow us to come to an effective judgment. And with all of these, with the planning for the themes and criteria, it's partly practicing the process of coming up with themes and this thought process so that you can go into the exam and be really well prepared effectively. But it's also some of this is revision. There are some key questions that could come up, and you should know that for a lot of electoral systems questions that come up, these three criteria are a great way to do it. So it's partly kind of practicing the process that you so that you can go into the exam and do it, but it's also having essay plans for enough key questions so that for a lot of questions that come up, you look at it and go, okay, perfect. I've revised that, or a question very similar. I know what themes I'm going to use, and then you can almost save yourself some time on planning. Next one, evaluate the view that the Prime Minister is now presidential, or the Prime Minister is now a president in all but name. Analyse and evaluate this statement. We need to think of three different ways we can analyse whether the Prime Minister is now like a president or whether they're not. So what does being more like a president mean? What would it look like? And these are kind of key things you should have studied and you'll be revising when you look at the Prime Minister topic effectively. So we can come up with kind of three ways. And as always, these aren't the only three ways you could do it, but these are three key ways. Is the PM now effectively a head of state? That's something that the president is, that the Prime Minister isn't. And this argument that the Prime Minister is presidential often focuses on this because the Prime Minister isn't the head of state in the UK. The monarch is. But we could argue the Prime Minister is now presidential because they really do represent the country in foreign policy, for example. Does the Prime Minister have a lot of bureaucratic support? That's something that the President has a lot of, the West Wing, effectively, in the United States. And we can argue that, okay, one key argument that the Prime Minister is now presidential, that you likely studied when you were studying this topic in class, is that the Prime Minister's got an increasing amount of support around them, whether that's through SPADs, for example, or through different departments within the Prime Minister's office. And finally, does the Prime Minister have personal legitimacy like a president? This is a kind of final key way you can analyze this question effectively, because the president, that's one of the key hallmarks of a president. They're elected personally rather than just being made prime minister due to their party, like in the UK. But one key argument that the prime minister is now presidential is that they're much more like a president, effectively, because they often have that personal legitimacy separate from their party. So that personal support. Someone like Boris Johnson might be a good example of that. He was popular beyond the party for a while until he became very unpopular, of course. And finally, evaluate the view that constitutional reforms introduced since 2010 have had a limited impact on the UK constitution. Here, okay, if we're analysing if constitutional reforms have been successful, one key thing we can do is just look at three key areas of reform. And that's where I'd go for Brexit. There's also a massive constitutional reform since 2010. Further devolution to Scotland, Wales and England, and parliamentary reforms. And that's kind of three different ways, three different types of reforms we're analysing, and then we'll be able to come to an effective answer to the question. So as I mentioned, to be prepared going to the exam, make sure you know the themes you would use for some key questions that could come up, but also practice coming up with themes on the spot for lots of different questions, including questions with difficult wording. And this is really how you'll make sure you'll be prepared. If you can't do themes, for some questions it's just very difficult to come up with themes, and you might go into the exam and just freeze effectively, and that's fine. That's it. These are very difficult exams, but what you want to give yourself is a bit of a backup, effectively. So if you go into the exam and you're facing a question you weren't expecting, and you can't come up with three themes, can't think of three themes to effectively answer the question, then you can instead try and plan it with kind of matched up arguments. And this is where I'd write down as some arguments for one side of the argument, arguments for the other, and then match them up effectively into 3 paragraphs. And the key here is matching them up in ways that creates effective debates within the paragraphs. And this is the exact same you're actually going to be doing in source questions, which we'll have a look at a bit later on. So say here, evaluate the view that direct democracy is superior to representative democracy. Or in AQA, this could be direct democracy is superior to representative democracy. Analyze and evaluate this statement. For me, this you might look at this and think, oh, I can't come up with themes. It's quite difficult, one, to come up with themes so effectively. I'm sure you could, but let's say you couldn't. And what I do then is write down all the arguments that direct democracy is superior that I can think of. So it directly involves the people in decision making. It's more democratic. In representative democracy, politicians do what's best for them, not what's best for voters. And that's why direct democracy is better. And finally, direct democracy gives equal weight to all votes, whereas representative democracy doesn't. So it's more fair. So for example, in representative democracy, everyone's vote in an election isn't kind of equal, because if you're in a safe seat or a marginal seat, it in some ways matters less, whereas your vote really does matter equally in a referendum, for example. But then we've got also some arguments that we've written down that representative democracy is superior. So representative democracy allows for accountability and effective representation of constituents. Direct democracy can lead to tyranny of the majority, which is really bad, therefore representative is better. The public can be manipulated in referendums in direct democracy, and representative democracy can be seen as more practical. So this is where you do this exam, you kind of quickly note down your key arguments, effectively, and then match them up. And the key here is to try and match them up in ways that creates effective debates within the paragraphs. So this first one, direct democracy directly involves the people in decision making. I'd look at the second side and think, okay, what matches up well with this? I'd think, okay, actually the public can be manipulated in referendums. That's a good counterpoint because yes, it directly involves the people, but if they're manipulated, then are they actually kind of being properly involved, or are they being duped? I then look at the second one. In representative democracy, politicians do what's best for them, not what's best for voters. And that matches up really well with the argument that actually, no, representative democracy is effective. It allows for accountability and effective representation of constituents. And finally, these latter ones match up as well. Direct democracy gives equal weight to all votes, whereas representative democracy doesn't. And we can counter that by saying, yes, it gives equal weight to all votes, but direct democracy leads to a tyranny of the majority. And you could also add in a kind of a final argument to that paragraph that the representative democracy is more practical, just as kind of a final little point. So this is kind of, if you can't come up with themes, this is the process you should go through. And it's similar for a question like this. Evaluate the view that the UK Constitution should be codified and entrenched. Another one where, for me, it's very difficult to come up with themes. So I'd write out all the arguments. And we've actually got kind of 9 full arguments here, so we're not necessarily going to use all of them. So the current constitution is too easy to amend, is a key argument. It should be codified. It doesn't protect rights effectively. It doesn't protect democracy effectively. And codifying it would make people more aware of their rights and the political system, helping to tackle the participation crisis. On the other hand, we can argue, actually, the current constitution shouldn't be codified because it does protect rights effectively. The Supreme Court currently does protect democracy well. Entrenching the constitution would give too much power to unelected judges, and codifying it would be a really difficult process that there wouldn't always be agreement on. And finally, the fact that Parliament can change the constitution currently means that it's always responsive to democracy. So we're not going to have time to use all of these arguments, but it's about matching them up into kind of 3 key paragraphs that would work well. So I'd first look at, I think some of the key arguments should be about democracy. So the current constitution doesn't have sufficient protections, and this works, we can counter that with, so the Supreme Court currently protects democracy well. Secondly, the argument that it's too easy to amend, I think, is a really key argument. And I think the counter there is that Parliament can change it, meaning that it's always responsive to democracy. And finally, on rights. So we've always here kind of worked out 3 themes, actually, even if we didn't know them at the start. And this is the kind of process you should go through if you don't know your themes. Write them out and then match them up into 3 really effective paragraphs. Crucially, with essay planning, it's practice, practice, practice. Don't just go into the exam and try and reproduce an essay plan you've memorized. You need to answer the specific question on the paper. This is really, really key. Yes, you want to use essay plans to practice and to help you memorize content. And often you will go into the exam and one of the questions will be very similar to an essay plan that you can use a very similar plan in. But you don't want to rely on that. You want to practice going into an exam, looking at some difficult questions and being able to plan them effectively and answer them. And that's all about practice. Try and practice planning essays in 5 minutes over and over again, because that's what you're going to need to do in the exam. You're going to need to go in and try and answer a question. The final quick thing we're going to have a look at in terms of essay planning then are factors questions. So these are kind of quite specific questions that explicitly ask you to judge whether the named factor in the question is the most important. So the key here is really spotting them. So evaluate the view that party policy is the most important factor determining voting behaviour in UK elections. It's asking you to compare a named factor with other factors, effectively. Is it the most important, or are other factors more important? Evaluate the view that the competence of the government is the most important factor determining the results of UK elections, or evaluate the view that the media is the most important reason for the success or failure of political parties in the UK. It's giving you a named factor and asking you to compare it to others. And though it might seem repetitive, and your instinct might be to just do 1 paragraph on each factor, so do, for this top one on party policy, then 1 on the media, and then 1 on leadership, for example. The Edexcel exam board are really specific in saying that they want the named factor to be in every paragraph. This is less so for AQA, who haven't been as prescriptive. So if you're an AQA student, kind of don't focus on this too much, though the structure I'm going to recommend can work really, really well. But if you're an Edexcel student, make sure you can recognize this type of question. And obviously you'll be able to see this in the recording as well. And you can make sure you kind of answer it in this specific way. So what they say it's the question is, evaluate the view that leadership is the most important factor in party success. What the Edexcel exam board advise against is doing, say, one paragraph on leadership, one on the media, and one on the electoral system. What they want is the named factor, leadership, named in the question, to be in every paragraph. So you're comparing leadership with three other factors. So leadership versus the media, then the electoral system versus leadership, then policy versus leadership. And the key here is to match them up well so you can have an effective debate within the paragraph. Because the risk here, which is why I think it is a bit weird as exam board advice, to be honest, is the risk is that you just repeat the same leadership argument 3 times. But what you do to kind of combat this is you kind of match them up well so that the leadership in the second and third paragraph is the counter to that final paragraph. So say in this third paragraph here, we're arguing that policy is more important. We can then counter that with actually leaders play a key role in driving the policy of their parties, for example. Or if it's electoral systems is more important in party success, we can say, actually no, because if a party has a really strong leader, even if they're a minor party, which is disadvantaged by first past the post, they can overcome it and have success due to their party leadership, for example. So that's not going to be most of the questions that come up. In most years, no factors question will come up in the exam. You just want to be prepared to kind of answer it in a way that the exam board want, just in case it does come up effectively. And the key here is to really compare the factors within your paragraphs. Don't treat them as separate. So do kind of, as I said, if you're doing a paragraph on the media versus leadership, don't just do one paragraph on the media being important and then counter, actually no, leadership is important. Really try and compare them and relate them to each other. So say you want to make an argument that the media is important, but also explain how it's more important than the media. And when you're then countering that, you want to argue, actually, no, leadership is more important than the media, or the media is more important than leadership. And this will make sure you don't repeat the same leadership argument 3 times. Okay, so let's have a look now at introductions. And I've got quite a clear 3-part structure I recommend for introductions. This isn't the only way you can write your introductions. It's absolutely not. But it's something that touches on everything an introduction needs to do. And if you're pushing for that kind of A or A star, it's a great thing you can do effectively. So I'd first introduce the topic or define any key terms. This immediately shows the examiner you understand the topic. If the essay question doesn't have anything obvious to define in the title, you can instead just write a sentence introducing the topic effectively. So you want to first kind of define any key terms. You then want to show the examiner how your essay will answer the question. This is really important. So you want to tell them what your 3 main paragraphs are going to focus on effectively. So if you selected theme, say this essay will analyse whether devolution's been a success by looking at democracy, the unity of the UK, and its impact on policy making. And I'll just tell the examiner immediately, they'll see, okay, they're covering a good range of arguments here. They know what they're talking about. And this is going to be a really effective essay that's well structured and covers enough arguments. And then finally, and this is the most important part, you want to state your answer to the question very clearly using the terms of the question and add some justification effectively. So it's not going to be as long as your conclusion, but you can start picking up some marks in terms of your evaluation in that introduction. And again, you want your introduction to be clear in your judgment, to be clear in your introduction and then consistent throughout your essay. So if you can have it straight away to the examiner at the end of your introduction, this is what I'm arguing, then you'll really impress the examiner. To give you some examples then, so evaluate the view that first past the post undermines the United Kingdom's representative democracy, or a similar question for AQA. We start by defining first past the post. First past the post is the electoral system used for UK general elections and local council elections in England and Wales. As a result, it plays a central role in the UK's representative democracy and constitution as a whole. So we're defining and linking it into the question. We're then setting out our paragraphs. This essay will analyse whether first past the post undermines the UK's representative democracy, but analyse its impact on representation, voter choice, and on the UK's governance. There are those three themes we had a look at. It will ultimately conclude that first past the post does undermine the UK's representative democracy, as it creates a parliament and government that almost never has majority support from the population, yet almost always has the power to enact whichever changes it wants. First past the post key weakness, the fact that it creates results that aren't proportional with voters' wishes, therefore undermined its purported strength of creating strong governments that can enact change. First past the post must be removed to protect British democracy. So there, a very clear three-part structure that you can just practice and practice and practice over and over again so you go into the exam and it's like second nature. And in this kind of final part here with the judgment, we're really using the terms of the question and making it clear. It will conclude that first past the post does undermine the UK's representative democracy. It's in no doubt to the examiner. We've directly answered the question. Then here, this is very much an A-star introduction, which is why there's quite a bit of justification and it's some quite complex evaluation, which we're going to have a look at later on. So you don't have to do as much detail as this in your judgment effectively, but you do need to make sure you're directly answering the question. And if you're already struggling kind of working at a D or a C, for example, or a B, I'd recommend just saying directly answering the question in this final part and then saying the most important reason why effectively. Similar one here, evaluate the view that direct democracy is superior to representative democracy. We start by defining direct democracy. Direct democracy is when individuals express their opinions and vote on laws and policies themselves and not through representatives acting on their behalf, which is representative democracy. So we're defining direct and representative democracy. And we're saying many consider it to be superior to representative democracy as it gives true power to the people. Every person's vote counts the same, and representative democracy is flawed as politicians follow their own interests. And sorry, up until before overall should be blue as well. Others disagree and argue that direct democracy creates tyranny of the majority, risks people being misled, and that as a result, representative democracy is more effective as experts make key decisions. So this should be in blue as well. And this is here, the setting out of the paragraphs, because we haven't got three themes, because as we had a look at, this one is where we've kind of matched up arguments. Another way you can set out your paragraphs is saying the three key arguments for one side and the three key arguments for the other side, which we've done here. And then we've got a judgment. Overall, this essay will argue that direct democracy is superior, clearly answering the question using the terms of the question, as it is the purest form of democracy that directly involves the people in decision making, ensuring the interests of the majority of the population are represented. There should be greater use of referendums on key political issues in the UK in order to supplement and improve representative democracy. That's a little kind of A-star tip we're going to have a look at in terms of evaluation, in terms of saying what you think should happen. It's this key structure, defining, setting out our paragraphs, and here, because it's not, we haven't got themes, we're setting out the key arguments for one side and the key arguments for the other, and then our overall judgment. And finally, this is a factors question. Evaluate the view that the competence of the government is the most important factor determining the results of UK elections. We're starting off by kind of introducing the topic. The UK's representative democracy gives voters the opportunity to decide whether to elect the government or to vote them out at least every 5 years. One of the key factors that influences the result is therefore voters' judgment on how competent the government has been since the previous election. This is only one of a range of factors that influence election results, and this essay will compare its importance with the influence of the media, social factors, and party leadership. So this is a factors question. So we've kind of, as always, introducing the topic. There's nothing really to define here, so we've introduced. And then we're setting out our paragraphs by saying that we're comparing the competence of the government with these three other factors. And then again, at the end, a direct judgment in relation to the question. Ultimately, this essay will argue that the competence of the government is the most important factor determining the results of UK elections. Even though other factors are considered, the 2024 election made clear that huge numbers of voters are willing to disregard these factors and switch their vote to other parties in order to punish the government for their performance and make clear they expect far better, especially in terms of professionalism and economic competence. So all of these are A-star introductions, which is why this kind of judgment is quite detailed effectively, but this three-part structure is something you should really practice. And you want in that final part to be directly answering the question and then justifying it. And if you're not pushing up for that A-star, that's fine. Just still directly answer the question and add the most important reason why. It doesn't need to be as complex evaluation as this. So I'm going to get on now to having a look at main paragraphs. Okay, So in terms of the structure of your main paragraphs in A-level politics essays, you want to start by clearly introducing your point in relation to the question. So for one, so start with one side of the argument and clearly introduce the point. You then want to explain the point, bring in relevant evidence or examples to support it, and then once you've brought in that example or that evidence, analyze it and explain how it supports the point. You then want to do so for the other side of the argument, introduce the counterpoint, explain it, bring in evidence, and then explain how that evidence supports the point, and then have a mini conclusion at the end where you kind of set out which side of the argument you find most persuasive and why, and that should be consistent with your argument in the introduction. Effectively, and we're going to have a look at this now by having a look at this question in Edexcel. Evaluate the view that the current Labour Party is closer to old Labour than it is to new Labour, and for AQA, current Labour Party policy is closer to old Labour than it is to new Labour. This is quite a kind of structured kind of main paragraph. So if you are pushing, I'd really recommend this if you're struggling. If you are pushing up for an A or an A star, you can have a little bit more flexibility in this. You obviously want points starting on each side of the argument, but you can have a bit more flexibility in terms of maybe adding a couple of examples or explaining in adding a bit more explanation before or after, for example. But this key structure, make sure you're picking. You're getting 30 marks in Edexcel especially, but also in AQA. You're being marked on AO1 knowledge, AO2 analysis, and AO3 evaluation. And AO1 knowledge is only 10 marks. So you really need to make sure that you have really effective analysis and evaluation. And doing this where you're explaining your point before the example and analysing that point, the example, to show how it supports the point, make sure you're picking up enough analysis marks, AO2, as well as knowledge marks. Whilst the mini conclusion, make sure you're picking up those AO3 evaluation marks throughout your essay, not just at the end in your conclusion. So this is why this structure works really well. I'm going to show you it now in practice for these two questions. So in answer to the question at the bottom, evaluate the view that current Labour Party policy is closer to old Labour than it is to new Labour. So start by clearly stating what your point is in relation to the question. Use the terms of the question and make sure it's clear. And what I mean by using the terms of the question, if it's saying, say, evaluate the view that devolution is a success, it should start with one argument that devolution's been a success is, or on the other hand, it could be argued that devolution hasn't been a success. Use those terms of the question, because then it'll be so clear to the examiner that you're directly answering the question. There's no need to use overly complicated or fancy language. You can set out your theme of the paragraph before you have a look at this as well, and I'll give you an example of that in a second. And after introducing your point, you should make sure, whether you do this in your point or after, you just make sure your point is explained in detail to show why it's a strong argument and is important in relation to the question. So we've got an example here. The most significant area of policy to analyse the position of the current Labour Party is according to economic policy. So that's here where we're setting out the theme of the paragraph, which you'll do in some paragraphs, but not in others effectively. Or in some essays, not in others. But then we're introducing our point. On the one hand, it can be argued that current Labour Party economic policy is closer to old Labour than it is to new Labour, using the terms of the question there, because Starmer and Reeves have demonstrated a clear commitment to the old Labour principles of supporting those in poverty and work, with generous state provision that is facilitated by taxation of businesses and the richest in society. So we're introducing a clear point in relation to the question that aligns with our theme, and it's a specific point that directly answers the question, and that's really, really important. What you want to do then is bring in evidence to support your point. So after introducing and explaining your point, you want to bring in an example or statistic or some evidence that illustrates and supports that point. You should make sure that this is a relevant example that demonstrates the point well. And you should kind of explain it well rather than just stating it. So this is key. You want to explain your examples and how they support the point. Recent examples are definitely good, and the Edexcel exam board have recently said actually it's really important to have recent examples. We've got kind of recent example packs on the Politics Explained website if you're interested, but you shouldn't only do the most recent examples. There should be a number of recent examples throughout your essay, but when you're picking the example for your point, you want it to be the best example that supports your specific point. Often that will be a recent example, but it might not be in other cases, for example. So we've introduced our point here, and now we're introducing our example. This can be seen in the government's most recent budget in 2025, in which it announced some small tax rises, including a new council tax surcharge on properties worth more than 2 million, and changes that improve the lives of those less well off in the UK. This included the two-child limit on benefits being scrapped and the minimum wage increasing from 12.21 to 12.71. So that's a key example of the 2025 budget that really clearly supports our point. After introducing that example, the evidence, you don't want to leave it there and then go straight into the second half of the second argument, the counter argument. You want to explain how it supports the point. And this is really key. It will enable you to pick up important analysis AO2 marks. So phrases like this shows, this suggests, or this demonstrates are really good ways to do this. You've introduced an example and then you're explaining how it supports the point. So we've introduced our example. These demonstrate clear alignment with the core old Labour approach of using generous state provision and regulation to improve the lives of the working class. So we've introduced our point, we've brought in this example, and then after that example, we're explaining how it supports the point. And that's really key to picking up those analysis marks. You then want to do the exact same for the other side of the argument. So introduce a clear counterpoint using the terms of the question, explain it, bring in evidence to support it, and then analyze it. They don't have to be complete equal size, the kind of the for and against argument in your paragraphs. It can be slightly shorter or longer, as long as it's got this kind of key structure of having a well-analysed point and evidence to support it. So on the other hand, it can instead be argued that Labour Party policy is far more similar to New Labour than it is to Old Labour. Again, clearly using the terms of the question. The examiner is going to have no doubt that we've directly answered the question and have two sides of the argument here. As Starmer's government has taken a similarly centrist and cautious approach to the economy rather than being ideologically left-wing. So a specific point in relation to the question. Though there were some measures that improved government provision in the 2025 budget, it was overall a very centrist budget, rather than one that increased taxes and public spending significantly to tackle inequality, as Corbyn's 2020-2019 manifesto advocated for. In both the 2024 and 2025 budgets, corporation tax, income tax and VAT were all kept the same, whilst there were departmental spending cuts totalling £6.5 billion in the latter. So we've introduced a clear specific point. We've then supported it here with a detailed example effectively. And then we're analysing that example to show how it supports the point. This non-ideological, cautious approach is far more similar to New Labour's emphasis on competent governments rather than Old Labour's strong commitment to use the state to improve equality. New Labour too were very cautious and didn't raise corporation tax, income tax or VAT in their first few years of power. So we've introduced that example and then we're clearly explaining how it supports the point, and that's going to pick up some vital AO2 analysis marks. And then finally, after setting out both sides of the argument, you should have a mini conclusion at the end of each paragraph where you bring in your evaluation. And the purpose of a mini conclusion is to explain which side of the debate in this paragraph you find the most persuasive and justify why. And this should be consistent with and link into your overall argument in the introduction and the conclusion. So as with the evaluation in your introduction, this should start with a clear statement of your judgment, following by justification of why you've come to this judgment. So you introduce both sides, clearly say which side you agree with and why, and that needs to be consistent with the argument throughout your essay effectively. So we've got an example here. Overall, there is no doubt that the current government isn't as ideologically committed to free market capitalism as New Labour's government is. So we're recognising a bit of a counterpoint, but it is nonetheless far closer to New Labour than it is to Old Labour. So a clear answer, a clear judgment. We're saying, no, the question is current party policy closer to Old Labour or New Labour? We're saying New Labour. Starmer's government has taken a non-ideological, cautious approach to governance, rejecting the strong commitment to left-wing principles of Old Labour governments since World War I. Okay, so that's the kind of key structure you want to bring in for your main paragraphs. Point for one side, explain that point, bring in evidence to support it, analyse that to show how it supports the point, do the same for the other side of the argument, and then a mini conclusion. We're going to look now at kind of synoptic links, which is something you need to do make sure you do in your main paragraphs in UK government, and then some key A-star tips. So this is quite a small thing. This only applies for Edexcel, for paper 2 in the essay question. What you'll see is at the end of your essay question in paper 2, it will say in your answer, you should draw on relevant knowledge and understanding of the study of component 1, UK politics and core political ideas. So this is effectively that in order to get a level 5 on this question, you need to make reference at least once in your essay to an area of content studied in UK politics. This is UK government. And you should try and do so at least twice. I wouldn't stress about this too much, as you'll likely be doing this naturally. And for some questions, it is easier than to do so than others, but examiners do recognise this a bit. So just to give you some examples of how you could do so. If in a UK government essay, you're already writing about a big government majority, quickly explain how that's caused by first past the post. Or if you're writing about ministerial responsibility or the factors that influence the popularity of the Prime Minister, reference the role of the media. Or when you're writing about Parliament, reference direct and representative democracy, Supreme Court, rights in context, sovereignty or the EU referendum. So you might be doing some of this anyway, right? Because they are interlinked. It's not like UK government is separate from UK politics, but it's just making sure you do so at least once and try and do so twice to make sure you do so in case you mess it up once effectively in your essay. And it doesn't need to be loads and loads of detail. It's just, okay, if we're arguing that Parliament can't hold the government to account because the government's got a big majority in Parliament, quickly say this is because caused by the first past the post electoral system, which causes a winner's bonus and governments with large majorities effectively. So you might be doing some of this naturally anyway. It's just making sure that you do so. Okay, some key A-star tips for these main paragraphs then effectively. And the first thing is using specific points. So you don't have to do these if you're not pushing up for an A-star. These are just some key kind of A-star tips. When explaining points in support of or against an argument in your paragraphs, make sure they're specific rather than just stating the theme of your paragraph. So say it's for a question, evaluate the view that minor parties don't matter in UK politics. What we could say is, one key argument that minor parties do matter is that they have significant influence over policy, and start there with our point. But we want to give a more specific point, and this is key to kind of pushing up for the A-star. The most persuasive argument that minor parties do matter in UK politics is that they're able to have significant influence over policy by raising the importance of the policies they support in the media and demonstrating public support for them. Major parties in government regularly see this support and implement the policies, as they fear that if they don't, they'll lose significant support in the next election. And then we go into the example. This is really, really key. You want to kind of add a bit more of a specific point before you go into your example. And we've got another example here at the bottom. One way, if you're not adding as much kind of detail, it's, on the other hand, it can be argued that minor parties don't matter in UK politics because the Labour and Conservative parties are dominant in terms of party funding. And then we might go into the example. But if we can be even more specific, on the other hand, it can be argued that minor parties don't matter in UK politics because the Labour and Conservative parties are dominant in terms of party funding, which gives them a major advantage in winning over voters during election campaigns through leafleting and targeted online advertising. As minor parties don't have the funding to do the same, they don't matter in the most important part of democratic politics, elections. So this is really, if you're pushing up for that A-star, but it's kind of doing these more specific points in relation to the question can be a great way to impress the examiner. The next point is having fully analysed examples. And the point here is it's better to have one well-selected, really fully and explained and analysed example than 2 or 3 short examples or cases. So here we're doing a question in relation to whether rights are effectively protected. And our point is that the Human Rights Act does protect rights effectively, as all legislation has to be compliant with the Act, and judges can declare earlier acts of Parliament incompatible with it. And Parliament usually then acts to address these issues raised by the courts, and Parliament also has a joint committee on Human Rights Act to scrutinise bills. We then want to support this with an example. And we don't want to do is just kind of have really quickly, for example, this could be seen in this case study. We really want to explain this example and analyse how it supports the point. For example, in A versus Secretary of State for the Home Department, part of the Anti-Terrorism, Crime and Security Act 2001 was declared incompatible with Articles 5 and 14 of the Human Rights Act by permitting the detention of suspected international terrorists in a way that discriminated on the grounds of nationality or immigration status. The Prevention of Terrorism Act 2005 was introduced by Parliament to fix this. So really detailed example. So we've added enough detail to bring in an example that really supports that point. And then we're analysing it. This shows that rights are effectively protected by the Human Rights Act, as the Supreme Court's declarations of incompatibility was respected and acted on by Parliament, ensuring that there is a rights-based culture where all legislation respects rights. So that's really, really key. We're really bringing a specific, fully explaining our examples and analysing to show how they support the point. And that's key if you're pushing up for the A star. And a final tip for the kind of main paragraphs, we've got some more A-star tips when we have a look at evaluation, is if you have time, use another point and example, not just another example. Take this with a pinch of salt. This is only if when you're an A-star student, this is only if you're an A-star student and you find yourself having spare time, which I know will not be many of you. It won't even be many of you with an A-star. But the point here is that if you are in this position, and you're doing 1 point for each side and an example for each side, and you find yourself with a bit of extra spare time, rather than just adding another example to support an existing point, what you can do is add another point and example to one side of the argument, because then what you'll do is you'll pick up more AO2 marks as well as AO1 marks. So what we look at here is, say we've done a question on economic policy, and we've done that point we used for the first side, that they're closer to old Labour, because there's a clear commitment to old Labour principles of supporting those in poverty and work, and we've given the 2025 budget as an example. And our counterpoint, we use a different one. There's much less of a commitment to nationalisation than old Labour. And we've got an example there. If you do this and you're an ASOS student and you've got a bit of spare time, your inclination might be, okay, I'm going to add another example for that first point. But a better way you can do it to pick up even more marks, if you have the time, is to add another point. So rather than just adding another example to support the same point, we can add another point that Starmer's government is closer to old Labour than new Labour. So we've said that it's kind of got commitment to those in poverty and work, but our second argument could be that it isn't strongly committed to privatisation and free market capitalism like New Labour's was, and then an example of that. And what that means is, if you have the time to do so, you're picking up more analysis marks as well as knowledge marks, rather than just some extra knowledge marks by adding in another example. But again, as I said, that's not going to apply for most students, effectively. Right, I've kind of run out of time there in terms of answering the questions. But again, as I said, I'll hang around at the end if you've got any more questions. We're going to have a look now at conclusions and evaluation. Okay, so 3 key principles of evaluation, and these are really, really important. First of all, you want to decide what you actually think. Don't just randomly pick a side. A lot of students will just be like, okay, I don't really care about this debate. I'm just going to randomly pick a side and then argue it. You're not going to do as well if you try and do that. What you want to do is really sit down, look at the question, and think about what you actually think, what your genuine view on this debate is, because then you're going to be much better able to fully explain it and answer the question. It will make sure you're confident in your judgment and you're able to convincingly explain and justify your answer. So don't just pick a side randomly, decide what you actually think. Secondly, be clear and consistent in your argument throughout the essay. I've said this before, but your conclusion shouldn't be a surprise to the examiner. Your judgment should be clear in your introduction, main paragraphs, and conclusion, and consistent throughout. And finally, crucially, you don't want to just state your judgment. And this applies in your introduction, in your mini conclusions, and in your conclusion. You want to really explain your reasoning behind it. And in doing that explaining of the reasoning behind it, that's where you're picking up the majority of your evaluation marks. So some ways to do this effectively is to really kind of ways to work out, okay, what do you think? Ask yourself, what do you think? Ask yourself, why do you think this? And what's the most important reason you think this? And think, why is my argument more persuasive than the other side? And if you can explain this, explain what your argument is, explain why, so explain the most important reasons for it, and explain why your argument is more persuasive than the other side of the argument. That's where you're going to make sure you're kind of fully evaluating and picking up those AO3 marks. And the main place you're going to be evaluating, of course, you're doing it as we looked at the end of your introduction, you're doing it in your mini conclusions, but a lot of your marks are going to be picked up in the conclusion. You do want to make sure absolutely that you do mini conclusions as well. But a lot of it's going to be conclusion. And the key purpose of the conclusion is to kind of clearly and finally state to the examiner your answer to the question. So they're in no doubt that this is your answer and you've clearly answered the question. And you want to demonstrate to them that it's clearly backed up with evidence, that it's logical and that it's persuasive. And in doing so, you're going to be bringing together So to justify it, you're going to be bringing together some of the key, most important arguments you've set out in the main paragraphs of your essay to justify it effectively. So you want to start by directly answering the question using the terms of the question. So if it's evaluate the view that the party policy determines voting behaviour in UK elections, you want to start with, in conclusion, it's clear that party policy no longer determines voting behaviour in UK elections. Or, in conclusion, it's clear that party policy does determine voting behaviour in UK elections. Secondly, you should synthesize and explain the most important reasons why you've come to this overall conclusion in as persuasive a way as you can. So really justify that judgment. And finally, you can restate your answer to the question so that it's clear to the examiner that it's been directly answered. You don't have to do this final part, but I think it's a good way to finish off your essay. If it works, it just leaves the examiner in no doubt you've directly answered the question. So I'll give you an example here of a bit of a lower A conclusion, but still a good conclusion that directly answers the question. In conclusion, the UK no longer has a two-party system. Instead, it has a multi-party system. That's directly answering the question. Evaluate the view that the UK no longer has a two-party system. And then we're bringing in some of the key reasons why. Over the past decade, minor parties have had a major influence on politics in the UK, both through being in government-involved bodies and through the potential for the spoiler effect, influencing major parties to adopt their policies. These have been some of the key arguments we would have covered in our main paragraphs. Further, this decline in support for the two main parties, below 60% in the 2024 election, suggests that this trend away from two-party dominance is set to continue, particularly with the rise in support for Reform UK. So maybe this is kind of more of a mid-A than a low A. But it does well. It directly answers the question and it states some of the most important reasons why. What we're going to have a look at now is some key A-star evaluation tips. What I would say is don't try and do all of these at once. And you absolutely, if you're not kind of pushing up for the top of that A-star, you don't have to do these, right? What you want to make sure you're doing is directly answer the question and justifying it as well as you can. If you're not pushing up for that A-star and you're not confident in your evaluation already, you might get yourself confused trying to do these. So just a little bit of a warning there. The first point is evaluate using the themes of your paragraphs. And this is kind of what someone asked a question about early on in the webinar. Can one of your paragraphs be against, so does it have to be 4, 4, 4 if you're arguing for the 4 argument in every paragraph, for example? And the argument is no, and that's where you can use your themes to justify your argument. So say the question is, evaluate the view that first past the post is the most effective electoral system in use in the UK. And our 3 themes are how effective it is in terms of representation, how effective it is in terms of voter choice, and how effective it is in terms of type of government created. What we can say is, okay, we could argue in our overall judgment, in our introduction conclusion, that first past the post should be scrapped because it's really bad in terms of voter choice and representation and proportionality. And therefore, even though it creates a strong government, it should be scrapped. So there, in that type of government created paragraph, we may have kind of argued, actually, first past the post is quite good in this, but it's still a consistent argument because we're saying, still a strong argument, first past should still be scrapped because these themes we've had a look at, these criteria, representation and voter choice, are far more important in a democracy. And that's what I mean in terms of using some of those themes. You can kind of justify your argument using the themes you selected in your paragraphs. Secondly, a good way to bring in some more nuance in that A-star evaluation is to consider recent events and change over time to justify your evaluation. So has politics changed in recent years in such a way that you've come to this particular conclusion? So for, again, looking at first past the post, a key thing that's changed in British politics in recent years is the growth of the multi-party system. So could you argue that now the most persuasive argument is that first past the post should be scrapped because of these changes to a multi-party system, which means that first past the post is even more undemocratic? Or there are other changes. Do we now have stronger governments or weaker governments? Just that kind of referencing changes over time can be a good way to impress the examiner. And if it seems relevant to the question, give an indication of what you think should change. So you don't have to do this, but this can be a good way to kind of finish off your conclusion. For example, if you've got a question on referendums, and the question is, evaluate the view that referendums are positive for British democracy. If you think they're really positive, you could say at the end, and there should therefore be greater use of referendums in the UK to improve democracy. Or if the question is asking you if devolution's been a success, and you're arguing that devolution's been a success everywhere except for England, add in that the English region should be given greater legislative powers as a result. Or if you're arguing that first past supposed should be scrapped, you should be saying what you think it should be replaced with. These are kind of 3 A-star tips. You don't have to do all of them. They're not all going to apply in every essay you're doing. But there's some key things you can bring into your conclusions. I've got some example A-star conclusions here, and the thing to bear in mind is that these are very much kind of A-star conclusions, so it is difficult to do these, but we've got kind of here. Evaluate the view that the current Conservative Party remains a Thatcherite party. And this is a good example of really justifying our judgment and also looking at kind of justifying it based on change over time. In conclusion, there's no doubt that the current Conservative Party remains a Thatcherite party. Not only is the party still clearly committed to the core economic principles of Thatcherism in privatisation and low taxation, the whole of British politics now is, including Starmer's Labour Party. Under May and Cameron, there was a stylistic shift to one nation conservatism, but not one in substance, as their government still accepted many of Thatcher's economic, welfare and foreign policies. Under Badenoch, the current Conservative Party is now once more strongly Thatcherite in style too, with a rejection of the one nation commitment to tackling climate change and progressive social policies. There is therefore no doubt, as we're repeating at the end, that the Conservative Party remains a Thatcherite party and has always done so since Thatcher came to power. This is kind of more justified, really bringing in detailed justification of our argument that you kind of want to do if you're pushing up to that A-star. And that brings in a little bit of a real justification of why and change over time, effectively. Evaluate the view that party policy determines voting behaviour in UK elections. In conclusion, it is clear that party policy no longer determines voting behaviour in UK elections. So directly answers the question. Prior to partisan de-alignment and class de-alignment, party policy without doubt did determine voting behaviour, as the majority of voters identified with either the left or the right and voted for Labour or the Tories accordingly. Today, however, there is no longer a clear left-right division between political parties, and there are frequent elections where the policies of the main parties are very similar, such as in 1997, 2010 and 2024, due to Labour having centrist policies in each of these elections. In these elections, party leadership is far more important in influencing voting behaviour than party policy, as this becomes the most identifiable difference between the parties. This is not to say that party policy has no influence, as it clearly did in 2019, but it's no longer the most important determinant of voting behaviour. Instead, party leadership is. So still making a really clear, strong argument in relation to the question, but we're bringing in some of that change over time and saying this has happened recently for these reasons, this kind of detailed justification. And a final example here, evaluate the view that the influence of the media and politics is exaggerated. In conclusion, the influence of the media and politics in the UK is somewhat exaggerated. It is exaggerated in terms of how it's sometimes suggested that the media determines how individuals vote, when in reality many voters don't vote according to the media they consume. The influence of the media in holding the government to account between elections and undermining democracy, particularly newspapers, isn't exaggerated, however. TV, radio and newspapers have played an important role in bringing down 2 recent prime ministers by exposing scandals, whilst newspapers undermine democracy in the UK as they are biased and driven by their own interests. Overall, the influence of the media is therefore exaggerated in terms of its impact on elections, but not exaggerated between elections. So that's why we're using our themes. And this is really, you need to be careful here, because this is where you should only do this if you're kind of working at an A-star, because this still makes a very strong argument. We're saying it's exaggerated in this way, but not exaggerated in this way. It's very clear. It's exaggerated on elections, but not between elections. But you need to make sure that you're doing this, still making a really strong argument, because otherwise you could, if you do it badly, you can be seen as sitting on the fence. But this is an example of using those themes effectively. I'm going to quickly look now at source or extract questions before we do that. Okay, so how do you want to approach source questions? So the key point here with source questions is that you get no marks for points that aren't from the source. This is really, really key. All of your points have to start from the source. It doesn't matter if you bring in the most brilliant point in relation to the question. If it's not in the source, you're going to get 0 AO1, 0 AO2 and 0 AO3 marks for it. So this is really key. All of your points need to start from the source. And I emphasize this so much because I've seen so many students who are working at a really good level who end up not getting that grade they want, because you can do some brilliant essays in relation to a source question, but if you're not using the points from the source, you're going to get no marks for it effectively. So what you want to do is to firstly go through the source and carefully pick out all the points for the first side of the argument, as well as all the points for the other side of the argument. So in the same way that we kind of did when we were doing that second type of planning, where you write down all the arguments on the side. So go to the source, all the arguments on one side, then all the arguments on the other. And make sure that you're picking up the points from the source in relation to the question, not the examples. That's really, really key. You then want to match them up in the exact same way we did in a way that creates an effective debate within the paragraph. So you kind of want to make sure that the debate, the arguments kind of relate to each other quite well. And then finally, before you start writing, as with essay questions, you want to decide on your overall judgment, which you find most persuasive. So this is how we're kind of approaching them. And I'll give you an example here. So this is an example source question. This part of a pack I'm bringing out soon of example source questions that I've written that you can practice. But I'll just show you, I'll give you just 2 minutes to have a quick read through it. And then I'll show you it analysed. So on the first side, so it's the question is evaluate the view that first past the post, using the source, evaluate the view that first past the post undermines democracy by excluding minor parties from British politics. And on the first side of the argument, we've got a few arguments. And it's kind of effectively arguing that it does. And that's because the Labour and the Tories have always been in power. The most important shifts have not come from minor parties, but from within the two main parties. And that despite receiving significant support across elections, minor parties have been unable to gain a foothold due to first past the post, which prevents other parties from challenging in government. And as a result, many voters who like the policies of smaller parties decide not to vote for them as they know they won't win power and their vote will be wasted. And secondly, the second side of the argument is effectively arguing that first past the post doesn't undermine democracy by excluding minor parties. It's saying that the Labour and Conservatives have consistently received support from the British electorate because they're popular, not because that's why they're there, not because of first past the post. And then the first past the post keeps fringe parties from being given seats, which protects democracy from extremism. Saying the vast majority of voters feel represented by one of the two main parties. And they say when a minor party has a good policy suggestion, one of Labour or the Tories usually adopts the idea, making sure they maintain the support of the electorate. So you want to kind of go through the sources and pick out all the points on each side, and then you want to match them up. And that's kind of what I've done here. So these are the points I've picked out on either side. Firstly, on the first side, for the argument that first past the post does undermine democracy, is that we've got kind of first past the post electoral system has guaranteed that either Labour Party or the Tory Party have always been dominant in British government. And they've caused the most important shifts effectively. So they've dominated government, and that's key why they undermine democracy, because it's excluded minor parties from government. A second key argument is that first past the post really prevents minor parties from gaining any foothold, because it kind of even when they have support, they're unable to kind of win MPs effectively. And finally, it undermines democracy as many voters who like the policies of smaller parties decide not to vote for them as they know their vote will be wasted. On the other side, three arguments that first past the post doesn't undermine democracy by excluding minor parties. We've got the Labour and the Conservatives. These two here are kind of successful because they've got major support, not because of the electoral system. We've got that first past the post keeps fringe parties from being given seats, and that protects democracy from extremism. And then finally, when a party has a good policy suggestion, one of the Labour and the Tories usually adopts the idea. And that's the argument that they're not excluded because they can still have influence. So I go through you want to go through your two articles, or go through kind of two highlighters and pick out points on either side. And then you want to match them up. And that's what I've done here with the highlighting. I think the point that minor parties have been excluded from government for 80 years matches up well with the counterpoint that actually they haven't been excluded because they've still been able to have an influence over policy. The argument that first past the post excludes minor parties from winning MPs even when they have support, we can contrast that well with actually that's good for democracy because it excludes extremist parties. And finally, the argument that first past the post stops voters from being able to vote for who they truly support is a good kind of works well with the counter that actually Labour and the Tories have dominated because they have majority support. So you want to go through, pick out all the points on one side, all the points on the other, and then match them up well. In terms of your introduction, the structure of your introduction should be exactly the same as in your 30-mark essays, but the only difference is that you should reference the source when showing the examiner how your essay will answer the question and when stating and justifying your answer to the question. So just bring in some of that language of the source effectively. So if you're setting out your kind of arguments on either side, setting out your paragraphs, the first half of the source argues this, and the second half of the source argues this. So you're just kind of using some language as a source, or when you're introducing your argument, overall, the most persuasive argument in the source is this. So just use so the language of the source effectively. And this gives you an example of it in an introduction. We've kind of defined first past post or introduced it. We're then setting out the arguments from the first side of the source. Article 1 in the source argues, then setting out the three arguments. Article 2 in the source argues, then setting out the three arguments, including by quoting a little bit. And then when we're introducing an argument, it's using the word source. Overall, the most persuasive argument in the source is. And just make sure that the examiner is clear we're directly answering the question and all of our points are from the source, right from the introduction. In terms of source question main paragraphs, what you want to do, as I said, is every point has to start from the source. So you want to start by clearly introducing your point in relation to the question, and this has to be from the source, and you should therefore normally introduce a quote or a reference to the source. So you're introducing that point from the source. You then, exactly the same as our as our kind of normal essays, explain the point in more detail. So really explain that point, bring into me your knowledge and analysis to do so. You then want to support it with an example. And this can be either one in the source, if it's there, or your own example. So you can't introduce your own points, but you can introduce your own examples to support the points in the source. You then want to analyze and explain how this example supports the point, which will enable you to pick up some kind of key AO2 marks. You then want to do the same for the other side of the argument. So start the counter from the source, explain, example, analyze, and then have a mini conclusion. So very similar to essay questions, just every point has to start from the source. To give you an example here then, another strong argument that first past post undermines democracy by excluding minor parties is that it pushes many voters who like the policies of smaller parties to not vote for them. So this is the third paragraph we looked at effectively, and we've clearly introduced the point there, including through quoting, so it's clearly from the source. And then we're explaining it. Due to the fact that first past the post rewards parties with geographically concentrated support, minor parties are very unlikely to win in a local constituency, as even if they have 10 to 20% of the support, this will be spread across the country rather than there being enough voters concentrated in constituencies to allow them to win. As the source states, voters are aware of this, they know they won't win, and their vote will be wasted if they vote for the minor party they truly support. So we're explaining that point from the source, and in doing that, you can bring back in some quotes if you want to. That's a good way to impress the examiner, is to bring back in quotes when it's relevant, kind of later in your paragraph as well. As a result, many voters instead vote tactically for the major party they like most, even if they don't strongly support this party. So we've kind of explained that point in detail. We then bring in our own example. For example, in the 2024 election, pressure group Make Votes Matter reported that in 2024, a fifth of voters intended to vote tactically. This supports the view that first past the post undermines democracy, as it reduces voter choice to such an extent that it prevents voters from exercising true democratic will. Instead, they're forced, I should say, vote, not work, sorry, tactically, which artificially understates the support there is for minor parties. So we've introduced the point using the source. We've clearly explained it. We've brought in our own example to support the point, and then we've analysed it to show how it supports the point. We do then do exactly the same for the other side. On the other hand, Article 2 suggests that first past the post doesn't undermine democracy by excluding minor parties, as Labour and the Conservatives' dominance is a result of their popularity rather than due to tactical voting. Okay, so clearly referencing the source. It argues that major parties are broad churches which, quote, the vast majority of voters feel represented by, which is why they consistently receive over 2/3 of the vote up until the 2024 election. So we really brought in and explained our point then. We're then supporting it with an example and some evidence. The Labour Party includes MPs who are more Corbynite and further to the left, as well as Starmer-right centrists. Similarly, the Conservative Party has always represented centre-right voters, as well as more right-wing populist voters. Therefore, rather than there being a crisis in British democracy due to minor parties not winning elections, this is the consequence of the will of the majority of the electorate who do not support the outlandish solutions suggested by minor parties. So again, clearly introducing the point from the source, supporting it with clear evidence effectively, introducing the point, explaining it, then supporting it with evidence, and then showing how that evidence or that example supports the point. And a great way if you're pushing for that A-star is to bring quote a little bit later in the source as well. When it's relevant, bring the source back in when it works. And then finally, you want to, in the same way as with an essay question, in your mini conclusion, directly state which side of the argument you find most persuasive and why, which we've done here. Okay, quickly going to show you another example of a source, just show you how it can work when there's a table, because this hasn't happened in a few years, but I'm pretty confident at some point too, the exam board are going to give you a source which has a table or a graph or something like that you need to grapple with. So this is the source, using the source, evaluate the view that the UK now has a multi-party system. And effectively have a quick read through the source. Here, you need to bring, if it's giving you a table, it probably wants you to draw one of your arguments from the table effectively. So we've got a table showing the vote share and the seat share at the 2024 election. So we can get kind of two arguments from here. It does have a multi-party system because there's significant vote share for minor parties. Or we can say it doesn't because the seat share is still dominated by the Labour and Conservative Party. So it will want you to get something from the table effectively. And then we've got some other arguments in these two paragraphs as well. And in exactly the same way, we're selecting the three arguments and then matching them up. And the ones here we've selected for the argument that the UK does have a multi-party system is that parties other than Labour and the Tories want a significant share of the vote in 2024. We've got that from the table. Other parties can influence policy even when they're not in government. And there are now 4 to 5 parties with significant support, not just 2 effectively. And the second side is that Labour and the Tories continue to dominate elections and win the vast majority of seats. And that's both in the table and this argument here. Labour and the Tories dominate policies as they're in government, and minor parties have limited power in Parliament. So I just wanted to give you another example to show you, again, this is how you match them up, and you can do so when it's with a table or a graph or something like that, as well as if it's just text, effectively. I'm going to quickly skip through this as another example of a source main paragraph, but we're kind of running out of time a little bit. So feel free to go back to the recording when I kind of upload this and have a look through these. Okay, so what we're going to have a look at now, before we finish off by looking at Edexcel, political ideas, and 12 marker questions, is we're going to spend just kind of 15 minutes or so looking at some AQA specific stuff. And that's going to be in relation to the extract questions, some of the specific 20 markers, and looking at the 9 markers as well. So the first key thing to look at is the extract questions. And what I mean here is particularly in relation to paper 1 and paper 2, UK and US, but also paper 3 as well. We're going to look at those in a bit more detail. And what you'll see is they're very similar to the ones we've looked at Edexcel. And that's why I started with Edexcel and why I wanted you to stay for that, because a lot of the advice is very, very similar. They're structured in a similar way where you've got 2 arguments in relation to a question, and that question is going to be phrased, analyze, evaluate, and compare the different arguments in the above extracts in relation to something effectively. And in some ways, you're going to want to have a lot of similarities. Firstly, you need to go through the sources and pick out points on either side in relation to that key debate. And you still need to match these up into paragraphs that have affected debates or comparisons within the paragraph. So arguments from one extract compared with an argument from the other extract, and then a conclusion. You also still want to aim for an introduction, 3 main paragraphs, and a conclusion, but you can do 2 for these extract questions in AQA. But if you can get to 3, you should try and get to 3. Your points still need to come from the extract. The AQA exam board really like the phrasing of you need to use the extract as a springboard to bring in your own knowledge and analysis to explain the arguments in the extract. So that's really key. Those extracts, the points need to start from the extract in the same way as we looked at with Edexcel, and you need to explain them. Explain and build on those points with your own knowledge and analysis effectively. And you still need clear evaluation in the introduction, in mini conclusions, and in the conclusion. That clearly states and explains which side of the argument you find most persuasive and why. So broadly, the structure's still the same in terms of having an introduction, main paragraphs, 2 or 3, but aim for 3, and a conclusion. And in those main paragraphs, you're starting with a point from one side of the source, explaining and analysing it, bring in your own examples to do so, then bring in the other side of the source and comparing it. And that's like this kind of language in the extracts. They want you to analyze, evaluate, and compare. So they want you to compare within those paragraphs the 2 sides of the source and analyze and explain those arguments. And crucially, they want you to evaluate as well which one you find most persuasive in your mini conclusions, your introduction, and your conclusion. There are a couple of important differences though, which I'm sure you kind of already know about. And the first is that in order to get above a level 3, you need to consider the provenance of the sources. So this is the bit of information under each extract about who wrote it and where it was written. For example, over here, the above extract is from the New Republic, an American magazine which comments on politics and contemporary culture from a liberal, progressive perspective, published in August 2017. Or over here, extract adapted from an article by A.C. Grayling for the politically independent magazine Prospect. A.C. Grayling is an academic at Northeastern University and supernumerary fellow of St Anne's College, Oxford. So that's what I mean when that's the bit where you're going to want to take the provenance from. Some teachers recommend doing this in a separate paragraph where you kind of start by looking at the provenance, and you can do so. But the best way, I think, the kind of most teachers in the exam board agree to do so is in your main paragraphs when explaining the points. And the key thing you want to do here is bring in language of such as this is a typical view, or this is surprising, or this is unsurprising by using that provenance. So after you've introduced a point from one of the extracts, you want to bring in your provenance to analyze it effectively. So one argument made in the extract is this, and then explain the argument. And then you can say, bring in the provenance. This is unsurprising because it's written by an academic from a top university, many of whom hold these views. And obviously do that in a bit more detail, but you might want to say if it's unsurprising, or you might want to say, actually, this is surprising as it's in a left-wing newspaper using that provenance, which doesn't normally hold these views. Or this is a very academic argument about the workings of the US Constitution, which is typical of something written in this paper or this source. Or given the fact it's written by the Financial Times, it's unsurprisingly analysing the issues from an economic lens. So that's kind of what you want to be doing. When you're introducing your points, bring in the provenance to explain whether it's surprising or whether it's more likely, whether it's typical, effectively, because that's explaining why that point's that is being made. We're saying, okay, this is unsurprising that this author is making this point because this, or this is unsurprising that in this paper this kind of argument is being made because it's a very economic paper or because it's a very left-wing paper. So that's where you want to bring in your provenance effectively. And secondly, dependent on the extracts, you could focus on similarities or differences in the source rather than just on how they disagree. So this is an important difference from Edexcel. Edexcel, they really want it to be kind of for versus against arguments. So points in the extract, in the source for one side of the argument and points against. And it's really the debate in terms of the argument. And though you absolutely can do that in a lot, and that's what you're going to be doing in a lot of your extract answers, what they also say is they're asking you to compare. You could also do a paragraph on similarities or differences rather than just how they disagree. So your first paragraph could be, it's still bringing in one side of the source, one extract, comparing it to another, and having an evaluation. But rather than it being like they disagree on this point, it could be one extract argues this, the second extract is similar. So you can explain a similarity in one of your paragraphs or a difference rather than just a disagreement, effectively. So they're the two key differences on the extract questions. They want you to bring in provenance, and I recommend doing that in your main paragraphs. And you can focus on similarities or differences rather than just on how the extracts disagree, effectively. Okay, next thing we're going to have a look at is political, and I'll take questions at the end in terms of all of this, effectively, AQA stuff. Next key thing quickly to have a look at is political ideas extracts. So these are structured in a very similar way. And you're effectively going to get an extract, and it's very likely to have two sources from thinkers from the same ideology, effectively. And as with the other extract answers, you need an introduction, main paragraphs that compare the arguments in the extract, and a conclusion that evaluates. So which do you find the most persuasive, or which is proven to be correct, or which is the most relevant today at some of those key kind of evaluative points. And the key language AQA want you to do here, what they describe is, they want you to pair and compare. In each main paragraph, you want to match up one argument or quote from the first extract with one argument or quote from the second extract. So what you really don't want to do is do a paragraph on each extract. So within your main paragraphs, you want a kind of point from one extract, and you want to really explain that. You then want to compare it to a point in the other extract and really explain that, and then kind of have a mini conclusion. So you want to firstly, in your main paragraph, introduce the point from one side, one extract effectively, Then use your own knowledge to analyze and explain it, including by explaining if it's from a particular strand of the ideology, bringing in other different thinkers from that strand who also support it. So use that kind of knowledge of the strand and other thinkers to support that point and explain what point that extract is making effectively. Then compare it with the point from the other extract and expand on it in the same way. So that's that comparison of how it's different or similar is really, really key. And for both sides, try and bring in some provenance from the extracts into your explanation. So in the same way that we just looked at with the other extract, is this typical of this thinker? Is there something about the particular extract type? For example, if it's in a book they wrote, is it theoretical? Like this is a theoretical argument because of this. Or does it try to persuade people? This is to be expected from this book because it's trying to persuade people to join the revolution, for example. Or if it's for example, one was like a Guardian obituary, this is a kind of more theoretical and kind of less impassioned because it's in an obituary, for example. So very similar to your normal extracts, you want points from each side of the extract that you're comparing and explaining each of them, and in the same way, bringing in provenance to explain why that argument's there, if that makes sense. Why this is a typical argument we can expect from this thinker, for example. Okay, that was the extract questions. I'm going to quickly run through some of the other key AQA specific types of questions now. The first is the political ideas 25 marker. So these are ones on the non-core ideology. So you'll only be doing one of these on nationalism, feminism, multiculturalism, or anarchism. And so there might be something like nationalism values the identity of a people over their rights. Analyze and evaluate this statement with reference to nationalist thinkers you've studied. Or for feminism, feminism must focus on economic and social equality rather than legal equality. Analyze and evaluate the statement with reference to the feminist thinkers you've studied. There's a number of different ways you can approach these questions, but the key thing you want to avoid is being too descriptive and just explaining the different thinkers one after another. That's really what you want to avoid effectively. You want to instead plan your answer based on points in answer to the question. So your points are likely to be how a particular strand supports this view or doesn't hold this view, which you can then explain and analyze with the ideas of key thinkers you've studied. So in paragraph 1, you might say the statement is persuasive because there's a clear agreement between these strands on it in this way. So nationalists do think this because there's clear agreement between these two strands on it. Or you could also do paragraphs on how there's disagreement between these strands. So you really want these kind of points to be for or against the statement effectively. And often points in favor of the statement will be, okay, these are ways that these strands agree. These nationalists or feminists or anarchist strands agree on this particular area, whilst your counters are going to be, okay, this statement isn't true because there's disagreement from these strands, for example. And you also want to evaluate in your introduction conclusion by directly answering the question. And this is likely to be focused. The key thing here is that the questions can really vary here, which is why you can't be as prescriptive really. You just want to make sure you're having points for paragraphs that are directly answering the questions, but you kind of want to evaluate by directly answering the question in your introduction and conclusion. And this is likely to be focused on the extent to which there's agreement or disagreement between the different strands of the ideology. Because if it's asking you if this is a key aim of anarchism, or if feminists believe this, or if nationalists believe this, if you're arguing yes, you're effectively arguing yes, there's significant agreement among different thinkers and strands on this effectively. Then the final 25 markers are these paper 2 25 markers, which are the comparative American and US ones. Again, different ways you can answer this question, but crucially here, you need to make sure that every paragraph includes clear comparison between the UK and the US. Don't treat them kind of separately and do one paragraph on each. That's really clear. And you also want to have clear evaluation in your introduction, conclusion, and mini conclusions that directly answers the question. So same as your kind of normal paper 1 for 25 markers effectively. So you want to either plan your answers based on points in relation to the question, either in support of it or against it. So in the first paragraph, the statement is persuasive, and then explain this by supporting it with analysis and evidence from the US and the UK. So that might be, yes, UK parties are more internally united than those in the UK, than those in the US. And then you do another paragraph for the counter. They're more internally united in the US, and then maybe another paragraph on that, or you could just do 2. Or you could do it thematically. So you could do paragraph 1, for example, on domestic policy, for this second question, within the executive, the US president is able to dominate, whereas the UK prime minister shares power. Analyze and evaluate this statement. You could look at it thematically. So, for, against, mini conclusion, looking at three different themes. So, the argument that the US president is able to dominate, whereas the UK prime minister shares power, and the counter argument for the first paragraph in terms of domestic policy, and then with a mini conclusion as well, for the second paragraph in terms of foreign policy, and for the third paragraph in terms of structure of government. Okay, so that's the 25 marks, and I'll take questions, and I said, in between. And the final thing to have a quick look at is AQA 9 markers. So make sure, and this is for paper 1 and paper 2, that you do the below structure. So I do think the extra example at the end is quite difficult to students, but effectively this is something that was kind of suggesting some exam board training, which was you want to start by setting out a clear point in answer to the question and explaining the point in detail. Secondly, you then want to give an example to support the point and explain how it supports the point. This next bit was really important. You want to analyze in relation to its significance. So either explain why the point is significant or why there's limitations to its significance. For example, has it become less significant more recently? And then finish off with giving another example to support and build on this effectively. This final example might be too much for many students to do in the time, but it is kind of recommended effectively to add another example at the end. And you obviously do 3 paragraphs of these. So point and explanation, example, analyze in relation to its significance, so either explain why it's significant or why there's limitations to its significance, and then bring in another example. So a question here, explain and analyze 3 ways in which pressure groups promote democracy in the UK. Start off with our clear point and explanation. One important way that pressure groups promote democracy in the UK is by putting pressure on the government between elections to make sure that policy reflects popular support. They do so by demonstrating popular support for key issues on social media and through the traditional media to convince the government to change policy. So that's kind of bringing our point and explaining our point. And we could have actually said outside of groups there, for example. For example, then we got an example. For example, in the summer of 2020, footballer Marcus Rashford led a campaign to extend free school meals to children during the school holidays. The campaign effectively used social media, traditional media, and e-petitions to generate a social movement and demonstrate public support, which made the government U-turn and accept the group's demands on the 16th of June 2020. So you want a specific, well-explained and accurate example, effectively. You then want to explain its significance. This shows that pressure groups enhance democracy in the UK as they cause real changes in policy by demonstrating popular support. This is highly significant as it ensures that the government doesn't become unaccountable between elections when it has a large majority, which is especially important as recent governments have had large majorities. This can also be seen more recently, and this is the final example you can add on, in the government's partial U-turn on inheritance tax changes, which is caused by National Farmers Union protests, effectively. So point and explanation, then a clear example, then explain how the example supports the point, and then explain why it's significant. And if you have time at the end, add another example. And the key things here are to have 3 points. They need to be separate points, so really distinct points in answer to the question. And they need to be accurate and have kind of detailed evidence to support them. That's how you do well and get the full marks in these 9 markers. And then it's very similar, finally, for the 9 markers for political ideas as well. You want to make sure that the 3 paragraphs follow the below structure. You want to start by introducing and explaining the thinker's point. So set out a clear point from one of the key thinkers in relation to the question and explain it. Secondly, you want to give an example to support the point. So this could be a quote or a specific idea from the thinker. So really build on it, explaining it in a little bit more detail. And then you want to analyze the point and example, for example, by explaining, and this will often be explaining, relating it to their strand, how this is typical of their strand of the ideology. Or you could say this was also supported by this thinker, for example. But normally you kind of want to analyze it by explaining why they hold this view effectively and linking it into the strand. And it's really important that all 3 paragraphs cover different points. For example, if you're bringing both Marx and Rosa Luxemburg, 2 revolutionary socialists, you need to make sure they make different points. Otherwise, you'll just be credited for one of them. So again, 3 separate clear points in relation to the question is really clear for here as well. So explain and analyze 3 ways in which socialist thinkers view the free market. So one of these paragraphs here. Finally, third way thinker Anthony Giddens disagreed with other socialists and saw free market capitalism in a very positive way, advocating for limited interference in the market. So a very clear point. We're then explaining on it and kind of bringing in that kind of Giddens specific argument. Giddens believed that in the late 20th and early 21st century, trusting the free market was the best way to drive economic growth. He argued that in the context of a globalized, technologically advanced economy, traditional models of state control and market intervention were no longer effective and critiqued Keynesianism for its potential to stifle market dynamics, supporting privatization rather than nationalized industries run in the interests of all. So that's kind of that specific things, how he disagreed with Keynesianism and supported privatization. And then we're kind of doing this final part of analyzing it and doing so by explaining how it's typical of a particular strand of the ideology. This reflected the fact that Giddens was a third way thinker, a strand of socialism that many other socialists don't see as socialist at all, as it sought to combine some of the principles of socialism with acceptance of free market capitalism, which thinkers such as Marx would have argued was ludicrous and simply can't be done, as capitalism is the root of all evil. So we're introducing a distinct point in relation to the question. We're explaining it in detail. We're bringing kind of some specific argument that the thinker made, and then we're analysing it, include having explaining it because they're part of a particular strand, and how it sits within socialism overall. Okay, before we have a look at 12 markers then, what we're going to have a look at now is the political idea 24 mark questions for Edexcel. So what do these 24 mark questions focus on? Your answers to political ideas questions are marked using the same assessment objectives. So you're still being analysed or marked based on AO1, your knowledge, AO2, your analysis, and AO3, your evaluation. And like 30 mark questions, they ask you to consider and compare both sides of an argument and come to an overall judgment. But they're phrased differently. They're not evaluate the view, they're to what extent. Every question starts with to what extent, and is going to be focused on how much agreement there is within liberalism, conservatism, or socialism. So this is the core political ideas questions. They can be slightly different for the non-core, but they're broadly similar in terms of focusing on, okay, does this ideology hold this overall view? To what extent is there agreement? And these questions will often be focused on four key areas: human nature, the state, society, or the economy. For example, to what extent do liberals agree on human nature? Or to what extent are conservatives united in their views on the state? Or to what extent do socialists fundamentally disagree about capitalism? But they can also take two other forms. You can have more general questions covering the whole ideology. So to what extent do socialists agree? Or to what extent do conservatives agree? Or just two strands? To what extent are revolutionary socialists different from social democrats? And you can also get questions on principles specific to each ideology, such as to what extent are conservatives united in their view of pragmatism? Or to what extent are socialists united in their view of workers' control? So that's those kind of principles specific to each ideology. So that's what these 24 markers focus on effectively. And there are a number of different structures that teachers recommend for answering questions on ideologies questions. And a lot of them are good. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend you switching if you're confident with one of them. There's one I'll tell you I recommend, but I wouldn't recommend switching because these can work well effectively. The first is to do one paragraph on agreement and one paragraph on an area of agreement in the ideology and two on an area of disagreement within the ideology, or vice versa. You could do two on agreement and one on disagreement. This is the one I recommend because this works well for every question. And what you do is you add a bit more evaluation to your introduction and conclusion to pick up the AO3 marks. You want to always start with an agreement paragraph there. If you don't have time, because you've only got 35 minutes for these, if you don't have time to do 3 paragraphs, what you can instead do is just one big paragraph on agreement and one big paragraph on disagreement. And this can work well. Obviously, I'd recommend, if possible, doing kind of 1 on agreement, 2 on disagreement, or vice versa. But if you only have time to write 2, that works as well. Another structure that some teachers recommend is doing more thematic paragraphs. So more similar to the other ones where you have agreement versus disagreement paragraphs. So within a paragraph, you have agreement, then disagreement, then mini conclusion. And you do that twice effectively. Some teachers even recommend 3 times. There's just not enough time for that. But that's a final structure we use, kind of agreement versus disagreement and then mini conclusion, and doing that twice effectively. For me, this can be good for some questions, especially broader questions, but it often doesn't work as well for some of the more specific questions and for a lot of questions, because sometimes there's just not two agreements or there's just not two disagreements effectively. So I keep going with that if you find it effective. But the one we're going to go through today, and I really recommend, is the one where there's one paragraph on agreement and two on disagreement or vice versa effectively. Okay, before you start writing your introduction, you should make sure, as with the 30-mark essays, you know the structure of your essay, what will be covered in your main paragraphs, and your overall judgment in relation to the question. And you should make sure to think in terms of clear points of agreement or disagreement within the ideology and between the strands. So what you really don't want to do is do separate paragraphs on each strand. What you want to do is select clear agreements between the strands and disagreements within the strands and analyze within those paragraphs the agreements by comparing the strands effectively. Crucially, you've probably heard this from your teacher, but your points and writing should be strand-led, not thinker-led. So what you don't want to do is there's agreement among conservatives because Hobbes agrees with Burke or because Burke agrees with Rand. What you want to do is instead is structure the agreements or disagreements around the strands. There's agreement within conservatism because traditional conservatives agree with the new right. And then you explain those, and then the think of them as examples of the strands effectively. So you definitely want to be using thinkers, but the point shouldn't be structured around this thinker agrees with this thinker. It should be this strand agrees with this strand. For example, then explain the strand and then bring in the thinkers of an example of the strand, effectively, their specific thought. And a final kind of key point is that your agreements and disagreements don't have to be on completely separate things. So, for example, there will often be broad agreement on a principle that you can do an agreement paragraph on. So on freedom and liberalism, for example, but also specific differences between strands on how they interpret freedom, for example. So negative versus positive freedom, but you can still do an agreement paragraph on freedom and then a disagreement paragraph on the specific interpretations of freedom, for example. And the final key thing to note, is that any agreement or disagreement used doesn't have to use every strand, particularly for something like socialism, right? Where there's more strands effectively. You don't have to, or well, socialism 3, conservatism 3 as well. You can consider every strand in a paragraph, but you don't have to, as long as each paragraph covers two strands and all strands are considered throughout the essay effectively. But one thing you really need to do is make sure you mention at least 3 key thinkers throughout the essay, otherwise you're going to be capped. So really make sure you name at least 3 of those named thinkers. You're probably going to naturally do that anyway if you're pushing up for some of the higher grades, but really make sure you do that. Okay, we're going to have a look at first at agreement paragraphs, and this is how you want to structure them. You want to start by clearly introducing the specific point of agreement using the terms of the question. You then want to explain in detail how there's agreement, why the ideology holds this belief, and why this point of agreement is important to the ideology. You don't have to do all of these, but really kind of think about, you've introduced this point of agreement, think about explaining what the agreement is and why they hold this belief, as that's a key thing where you're going to really pick up those analysis and knowledge marks by truly kind of fully explaining the point and the ideology effectively. In doing so, you're likely going to link into some of the core principles of the ideology, as well as demonstrating how there's agreement between different strands. So 2 key things you want to do there. You want to bring into the kind of core principles to explain it, as well as the strands, and really focus on why they agree on a point. And by drawing on other key principles could be a great way to do that. We're going to look at an example in a second. And in order to show how this belief is supported by different strands of the ideology, you should bring in and explain the specific ideas of thinkers as examples, effectively. And then finally, you want to use a summary sentence at the end to reiterate the point of the paragraph and link it back to your overall argument in the introduction. Therefore, bring in some AO3, even if it's not a mini conclusion. So I'll give you an example here. To what extent do conservatives agree on the economy? Firstly, we're introducing our key point of agreement. A highly important agreement among conservatives in relation to the economy is they all strongly support capitalism and property rights, which are consistent with the conservative principles of pragmatism and an organic society. So a clear, specific point. Conservatives support capitalism primarily because they see it as the most practical and efficient economic system. It is historically proven to generate wealth and it is therefore the pragmatic thing to do to maintain it and listen to the accumulated wisdom of tradition rather than trying to transform the economy based on idealistic principles. What we've done there is we've explained why the ideology conservatism supports capitalism, and done so by explaining it with another core, one of the core principles, effectively, which is pragmatism. It's the pragmatic thing for them to do, effectively. And then we're bringing a thinker to support it. Traditional conservative Michael Oakeshott, for example, supported capitalism as he saw it as a tried and tested system, as opposed to the ideological dogmatism that led to support for communism in the 20th century. In On Being Conservative, he wrote, "To be conservative, then, is to prefer the familiar to the unknown, showing the conservative support for tried and tested systems." So you don't always have to quote. You don't, the quotes aren't overly important, but they can be useful. And here we're bringing a thinker to support this kind of analysis, which is really, really key. We're not leading with the thinker, we're bringing it into support. Conservatives also support capitalism due to their principle of an organic society. So again, explaining it with a principle. Capitalism has evolved naturally over time rather than being planned, and the idea of the free market in which individuals naturally trade with each other is consistent with the organic interaction between people and communities. The new right, especially neoliberalism, also sees this as organic and supports the free market as it allows individuals to act freely without interference, so explaining it through some of the strands as well. This was key for neoliberals like Ayn Rand, something bringing in a thinker as an example, whose theory of objectivism believed that individual liberty was paramount and the economy should be structured to allow individuals to pursue self-interest. So we've introduced the point. We're explaining how there's agreement, and why the ideology holds this kind of agreement, that holds this belief, including by relating it to core principles and the strands and bringing in thinkers as examples. I've put this in red here because this is it only if you're aiming for an A star. You could add another sub point to this agreement paragraph. But most of you would kind of just go on then to the summing it up. And this is the final part where you're summing up the agreement paragraph. Overall, there is therefore a clear economic agreement among conservatives in relation to supporting capitalism and property rights. As the remainder of this essay will demonstrate, however, these broad agreements are undermined not only by the level of state intervention they support within capitalism, but also the fact that the new right rejects core conservative beliefs, including pragmatism and tradition, and supports capitalism due to an ideological support for freedom. So here, if your overall argument is agreement, you'll be bringing it together and pointing back to that overall argument. But here, the overall argument is disagreement. So we're kind of summarizing the key point, but saying actually, but no, later in the essay, we're going to disprove this effectively. So that's where you bring into that evaluation by relating it to the question. You don't have to do that, but it can be a good thing to make sure you're picking up some evaluation marks in your main paragraphs too. In terms of disagreement paragraphs, these in some ways are a little bit easier. You want to start by clearly introducing the specific point of disagreement using the terms of the question. You then want to start with one strand and explain in detail what their view is, why they hold this view, and bring in a thinker to support. And you can link into core principles if it's relevant. You then want to compare it and explain how another strand disagrees, because it's a disagreement paragraph. And again, do the same, explain why they hold this view and bring in a thinker to support, but really focus on how there's disagreement between the strands and why. In some paragraphs, you'll do the same with a third strand, for example, in conservatism and socialism. And then finally, a summary sentence reiterating the point of the paragraph at the end and linking it back to your overall argument in your introduction. So we can see it here with the first side of the argument. Firstly, clearly introducing the disagreement. A key disagreement among socialists in relation to human nature is about whether common humanity can be realised within a capitalist system or whether capitalism must be abolished for the intrinsically cooperative and sociable nature of humanity to flourish. With that, so we've introduced a specific point. And specificity is really important, as we spoke about in the 30 markers as well. We then introduce it with the first strand. Revolutionary socialists argue that capitalism must be abolished as it distorts and suppresses the natural positive tendencies of human nature, making it instead competitive and selfishly pursue profit. So explaining, starting with the strand, not the thinker, and we're explaining exactly what they think. We then bring in a thinker to support it. Rosa Luxemburg noted that this divides workers and turns them against each other. Marx and Engels argued that this also leads to a false consciousness, where the proletariat or working class is misguided to accept the capitalist system as just and natural. These specific ideas are the key thinkers to support it. And as we mentioned, you need at least 3 key thinkers throughout the essay. For revolutionary socialists, capitalism must be completely abolished as a result, as it is the central problem in realizing the true cooperative nature of humanity. By abolishing capitalism, human nature can flourish in a communist society based on collectivism and cooperation between individuals. So we've really explained the revolutionary socialist view in relation to the point, including by really explaining why they believe it, what they believe, and bringing in thinkers to support. We then want to contrast it effectively with the other strands. This could just be one strand, or you could do it with two here. Social Democrats and the third way disagree and argue that capitalism doesn't need to be replaced for common humanity to flourish. So really clearly stating that comparison, that disagreement between the strands. While acknowledging the challenges and inequalities inherent in capitalism, Social Democrats argue that it can be managed through Keynesianism and a mixed economy to allow for cooperation, altruism, and community to flourish even within a capitalist framework. So really explaining the views of Social Democrats first, of the strand, and then we bring in the thinker to support the strand. Crosland, for example, argued that capitalism had fundamentally changed in the 20th century. It was no longer defined by the binary exploitation of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie, and human nature could now thrive within capitalism. And then we're explaining this is also supported by the third way, so saying how the third way also disagreed with revolutionary socialists, who argued that common humanity could thrive within free market capitalism, as individuals could be supported to reach their potential through education and other measures to promote equality of opportunity, whilst there could be strong communities at the same time. And this reflects the fact that the third way didn't see individualism and community as mutually exclusive, but instead as complementary. So we've kind of introduced the key point. We've explained it for the first strand and really explained why they believe it and brought in thinkers to support. We then explained how the other strands disagree and really explained what they think and brought in thinkers to support there as well. And then we're finishing off by summarizing, bringing together over that argument. Overall, this shows how there is a major disagreement between socialists in relation to common humanity under capitalism. This disagreement is highly significant and undermines their broad agreement on common humanity, as revolutionary socialists would argue the other strands don't support common humanity at all, as they believe it can be achieved within a capitalist framework. So really, here, this paragraph is in agreement with our overall argument in the essay that there's more disagreement than agreement. So we're really hammering it home and supporting its significance. Okay, before we have a look at some key A-star tips for this, I just wanted to show you looking at some difficult questions. So you can get difficult questions like this. They're not just going to be on human nature, society, economy, or the state. You can also get more specific questions. But the key thing you want to do with questions like this is to still think about specific points of agreement and specific points of disagreement. So if it's to what extent do socialists agree on equality, I go firstly with a key agreement that society should and can be structured to pursue equality. How equality is a key driving principle of socialism in all of its strands, even though they support different kinds of equality, fundamentally see it as a driving principle. As the capitalist system left completely alone drives structural inequalities. But then we've got two specific disagreements. How socialists disagree on whether equality of opportunity should be promoted. So that's revolutionary socialists versus social democrats. Revolutionary socialists, absolute equality versus social democrats, some equality of outcome, but also equality of opportunity. And the third way is just equality of opportunity. And then finally, the disagreement on whether capitalism needs to be abolished to promote equality. And that's, of course, revolutionary socialists against the others. So I'm not going to go through the two other examples of this, but the key point here effectively is to make sure you have specific agreements or disagreements for your paragraphs. That's how you want to structure your answers to these questions effectively. Okay. The final thing to have a look at here is then, okay, how can we get an A-star in these questions? And the first key point to point out is that introductions and conclusions are even more important than in the 30 markers. In normal 30-mark essay, you pick up AO3 evaluation marks in your main paragraph mini conclusions. However, as there aren't many conclusions in this kind of structure we recommend, you need to pick up most of your AO3 marks. Also, we did some kind of little summary sentences at the end. But you need to pick up most of your AO3 marks in your introduction and conclusion, where you kind of it's really important to kind of fully explain and justify your overall judgment. And this, for me, is the most difficult part of A-level politics, evaluation for these political ideas essays. In your essays, you're going to be explaining areas in which the strands disagree and explaining areas in which they agree within the ideology. What's difficult is coming to an overall agreement about Do they agree more? Do they disagree more? What is the extent of agreement? And being able to justify it. And this shouldn't be as simple as there are more points for agreement, therefore agreement's more important, or vice versa. Instead, you need to clearly explain the extent you think to the extent to which you think they agree and why, which includes weighing up the importance of different points and whether judging whether some of the disagreements between the strands are only minor differences that may reflect an adaptation of the ideology over time, or whether they undermine the areas of agreement. Simply saying that their disagreement is more important and then stating the points you've already stated isn't enough, and you're not going to pick up many AO3 marks for that. And actually, students consistently do the worst in AO at any part of the A level in AO3 for these ideologies questions. So you really want to practice this. And here are some ideas you could think about doing it, how you can justify. So, could you argue they disagree because more than they agree? There's fundamental disagreement in the ideology because they disagree on such an important point that one strand wouldn't even consider one of the other strands a true part of the ideology. For example, socialism. Revolutionary socialists, such as Marx, believe capitalism is the root of all evil and therefore wouldn't consider the Social Democrats, let alone the Third Way, socialists at all, as they accept capitalism to a large extent. Therefore, this demonstrates very limited agreement within socialism and they disagree a huge amount. That's some kind of persuasive justification you could bring in. Or could you argue actually there's more agreement within ideology because the disagreements actually just reflect a adaptation of the ideology over time to new contexts, while they still hold the core principles of the ideology and agree on those. For example, modern liberalism does advocate for more state intervention than classical liberals. But overall, there's still more agreement because this is just liberalism adapting and evolving over time, whilst they still hold those kind of core principles of liberty and democracy and freedom. They still fundamentally agree on them, therefore, there's more agreement. Or could you argue, one key thing you can do is, can you argue that there is more disagreement? They disagree to a huge extent because one strand rejects a core principle of the ideology. And this could be seen in conservatism, for example. The new right kind of effectively rejects the idea of an organic society and rejects the idea of pragmatism. And therefore, you could argue there's much more disagreement within conservatism than there is agreement. And you could argue something similar with the Third Way for socialism, for example. So the key point here is just to really try and explain your judgment, why you've come to that judgment. And these are some ways you could potentially think about doing so, because it's really difficult to pick up those AO3 marks in these 24 marked essays. Just to give you some examples of how I've done some example introductions and conclusions. This one's, to what extent do conservatives agree on paternalism? We started by kind of defining conservatism. Conservatism emerged as a response to the French Revolution, which upended the traditional aristocratic religious order in favour of Enlightenment ideals and caused chaos in society as a result. A key principle of the conservative ideologies that emerged was paternalism, the idea that the state should act in a way that looks after society in order to maintain order, hierarchy, and to make sure that effective decisions are made. So you don't really need to set out your paragraphs, but what you can do, but what I've done is you start by introducing the topic, so introducing conservatism and paternalism. And then what you want to do is really persuasively put forward your argument and justification. This essay will argue there's significant agreement between traditional conservatives and One Nation conservatives, which are both strongly supportive of hierarchy and paternalism to maintain the existing structure of society and govern it in the interest of all. However, it will ultimately conclude that conservatives largely disagree on paternalism, so really strong answer to the question, as the new right, a key conservative strand, fundamentally rejects paternalism due to the fact that their primary motive is promoting negative liberty rather than preserving stability and structure in society, as is the case for other conservatives. We're arguing they disagree to a great extent because the new right rejects the key question. They reject paternalism altogether. I'm just going to skip over to the next one. You can have a look at that other one in the recording if you want. But this one is, to what extent do socialists agree on collectivism? So in conclusion, socialists agree on collectivism to a large extent. Though revolutionary socialists and social democrats disagree on whether capitalism needs to be abolished to achieve collectivism, both of their beliefs about the economy and society are driven by promoting the interests of society as a whole rather than the individual. They fundamentally agree that collectivism is morally right, the most effective economic system, and that the expansion of the state and workers' control over key industries are key to how it can be achieved in practice. The third way's rejection of collectivism is it absolute and a major disagreement with the other strands. However, this doesn't undermine the agreement within socialism, as the third way shouldn't be considered socialist at all. Not only do they reject the key principle of collectivism, this is influenced by their rejection of social class, worker control, and equality of outcome, as well as their strong support for free market capitalism. So this is very much an A-star conclusion, but what we're doing here is making a strong argument for agreement, explaining it as what you want to do in your conclusion, really justifying it. And here we're justifying it by saying, actually, there's agreement within socialism, even if the third way disagree, because the third way aren't socialists at all. So it's very, very difficult to do evaluation for these 24 mark essays, but the key thing you want to be doing is kind of really try and explain in as much detail as you can to the examiner why you believe what you believe. And some of those key points about, okay, does one strand reject a core principle? Is there such a fundamental disagreement that one strand wouldn't consider another strand part of the ideology at all? They can be key things to justify your argument. So just to sum up, some key points to get the top marks in 24 mark questions. Firstly, really focus on explaining why an ideology or strand supports a particular point. Knowing and being able to explain the detail well is really important here to pick up those AO1 and AO2 marks. And this will often mean you need to bring in core principles and explain why they're important and lead to an ideology or a strand supporting a particular view. Make sure you can bring in key thinkers to support your points. Quotes aren't very important, but being able to explain the specific views of a thinker is. And as I mentioned, you need at least 3 key thinkers throughout your essay. You want a clear, well-justified evaluation that really evaluates. As I mentioned, AO3 is really difficult for political ideas questions. You want to cover some kind of key agreements and disagreements in relation to the question, and make sure you're focused on comparing the strands and thinking about the ideology as a whole and how they agree or disagree, and why there's significant agreement or disagreement. Make sure it's strand-led, not thinker-led. Have a look now at 12 markers for Edexcel USA. So, and we're going to first look at the examine question. So, the examine question will ask you either about the similarities or differences between a particular part of the political system in the UK and the US. And you'll get 2 questions and you'll pick between them. So they could be things such as examine the differences between devolution and federalism, or examine the similarities between devolution and federalism. Or it could be lots of different parts of comparing the US with the UK. It could be Prime Minister versus the President. It could be the constitutions as it is here. It could be aspects of the legislatures. Lots of different parts, but they're really focused on similarities or differences between a particular part of the political system in the UK and the US. And what you need to do is select 3 clear points. 2 if you don't have time, but you really should be trying to do 3. You don't need an introduction or conclusion at all. And within each paragraph, you want to first clearly introduce the point and how it's a similarity or difference between the US and the UK. Make sure that it's specific and well selected. You then want to explain how it's the case in one country and bring in specific knowledge and an example, if relevant, to support it. Then compare and explain how it's similar or different in the other country using specific knowledge and an example to support it in that comparative language effectively. And you just want to do 3 of those. And doing well in the 12 markers isn't about being fancy, it's about consistency and doing it well, for making sure you're picking up those 4 marks for every paragraph effectively by doing it well every time, making sure you've got that accurate information and clear specific points. So, for example, examine the similarities in the relationship between the 2 houses in Congress and Parliament. It doesn't need to be this long, but it's an example of kind of very much a full mark one. So you start by setting out your point. One key similarity in the relationship between the 2 chambers of the UK Parliament and US Congress is that they work together to pass legislation, which allows for checks and balances in the legislative process and more effective legislation as a result. So it's a specific point in relation to the question. We're then explaining it for the US. The bicameral structure of the US Congress and system of checks and balances in the US Constitution leads to both the House of Representatives and Senate having to consent for a piece of legislation to be passed. This collaborative process ensures that each bill is thoroughly examined and refined before it becomes law. For example, the bipartisan infrastructure law required significant cooperation between the House and Senate. The House passed its version of the bill, which was then sent off to the Senate. After extensive negotiations and amendments, the Senate passed its version of the bill, which included enhanced measures for environmental sustainability and climate resilience, which was reconciled with the House version in a conference committee before final approval. So we've got a clear point of similarity. We're then explaining it for one country and giving an example. And then we want to use comparative language to bring in the other country. Similarly, in the UK Parliament, there is significant collaboration and cooperation between the Commons and Lords in order to pass legislation that majorities in both chambers can vote for. The Lords plays a key role in legislative scrutiny, often suggesting importing technical amendments to improve the working of the bill, which are almost always accepted by the Commons. And then an example of that. So you kind of want a clear comparative point, explain it for one country and bring an example, and then use comparative language similarly, and then explain how it's the same for another country and bring in an example as well. Another example here, and this is for differences. So it's kind of similar for the differences effectively, where you want to introduce the point of difference. Another important difference between federalism and devolution is whether the distribution of power among regions is symmetrical or asymmetrical, so a clear specific point. We then explain it for the first country. In the United States, the Constitution guarantees that every state has equal authority in areas such as education, law enforcement, and local taxation. Even though policies may differ between states, they have equal power to determine policy, and the 10th Amendment reinforces this by reserving all powers not delegated to the federal government to the states or the people, ensuring a balanced and equal distribution of power across all states. So it's not really necessarily an example there, but some specific, we're explaining how it is in the US and bringing in some specific detail. We're then going to bring in the UK and explain how it's different. Devolution, by contrast, is asymmetrical, so comparative language, with different regions having different degrees of legislative power, again explaining how it's different. Scotland has primary legislative control over health, education and justice, and significant fiscal autonomy, including setting income tax rates and bans. Though Wales also has substantial control over public services, it does not have control over justice and policing and has limited fiscal autonomy compared to Scotland, whilst England doesn't have a parliament at all. England has devolved bodies in the form of city regions, but even these don't have primary legislative control. This can be seen as undermining equal citizenship and access to democracy in the UK due to some areas have more local control than others, which is not a problem in the US due to the symmetry of federalism. So a specific point, explain it for one country with an example, explain it for another, but really explain how it's different when you're bringing in that second country effectively. And then the other type of question, you don't get a choice for this one, is you also do one on an analyze question, which is structured in a very similar way, but it's analyze rather than evaluate. And for this, so it'll be something like analyze how the role and powers of the US President and the UK Prime Minister are similar. In your answer, you must consider the relevance of at least one comparative theory. And the key point here is you need to use the exact same structure and approach to the 12-mark exam in question, with kind of 3 paragraphs on points of, it would be kind of similarity here or disagreement in relation to the question. But at the end, you need to bring in a comparative theory at the end of 1 or 2 of the main paragraphs to explain the comparative point. And this is structural theory, cultural theory, or rational choice theory. I'm not going to be explaining these today, just giving you some examples of how you use them in the structure effectively. And I'd recommend trying to do it in at least 2, just in case you don't do it right if you just do one of them. So this is the exact same paragraph we'd use if it was an analyzed question. You just add in explaining why there's that similarity or why there's that difference. So this is a same point we made about the relationship between the 2 houses of Congress in Congress and in Parliament, but then explaining the similarity at the end with a theory. This similarity can be explained by a structural approach, as the bicameral nature of legislatures in both systems is designed to ensure cooperation and thorough scrutiny of legislation. This is important protection of democracy in both systems, designed to ensure broad support for legislation. So we're explaining it with a structural approach because it's due to the bicameral nature of the systems. This one for devolution, we've explained with a cultural theory. So this is the same paragraph made for devolution. You just tag on at the end why there's this difference. So explain why there's this difference with one of the theories. This difference can be explained by cultural theory, in particular due to the different historical contexts. Federalism's symmetry was influenced by the fact that the US was founded by 13 already established colonies coming together into one nation and not accepting different powers. By contrast, devolution's asymmetry reflects the fact that devolution was established in 1997-98, a point when Scotland's sense of national identity was much greater than that of Wales or England. So you have exactly the same as the exam in questions. Point, Explain for one country with an example, explain how it's different or similar for the other country with an example. Then you bring in the theory at the end to explain why there's this difference or similarity. Then we've got an example here for rational choice theory as well. So the point here is that a similarity between the powers of the US and UK courts is that both the final court of appeal, allowing them to review and rule on appeals from lower courts. And we're saying that this can be explained by rational choice theory, as in both countries, those who decided on the structure of the political system and constitution recognised that a final court of appeal was necessary to ensure clarity about the constitution and law and how it should be implemented across the country. So explaining with that rational choice theory. Okay, great. So the final thing we're going to have a look at then is the 12 markers for Edexcel for global politics. Just like with US, you get examine and analyze questions. So the examine question will either ask you either about the similarities or differences between two institutions or theories or developments or factors in global politics. And AO3 is not assessed, it's only knowledge and analysis effectively. So it might be examine the differences between great powers and superpowers, or examine the main criticisms of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, or the similarities in the role and effectiveness of the G7 and the role and effectiveness of the G20. So it's asking you to compare two institutions, theories, developments, or factors that you would have learned in global politics effectively. You need to select 3 clear points, or 2 if you don't have time, but try and do 3. And you don't need an introduction or conclusion. Don't waste your time doing those. And within each paragraph, you want to first clearly introduce the point and how it's a similarity or difference between the 2 institutions or developments in the question. So make sure it's specific and well selected. Then explain how it's the case for the first institution or development. Bring in specific knowledge and a specific example if relevant to do so. Then explain and use comparative language to explain how it's similar or different for the other institutional development, again, using specific knowledge and an example if relevant. And that's it effectively. You want to do that 3 times. So doing well in these 12 markers isn't about being fancy. It's about that consistency and doing it well for 3 paragraphs. So to give you an example, examine the similarities between the role and significance of the World Trade Organization and the role and significance of the International Monetary Fund. So we start with a specific point of similarity. An important similarity between the IMF and WTO is that they both seek to promote global economic stability and growth. Clear point. We're then going into the first one and explaining it for the IMF. The IMF was established to rebuild and bring stability to the global economy following World War II and to prevent economic crises similar to the Great Depression, and maintaining economic stability remains its central aim today. It does so primarily by lending money to countries facing balance of payments problems and by monitoring national economies in order to prevent economic crises that could have a global impact. For example, when Greece faced a severe debt crisis in 2010 and was on the verge of default, the IMF worked with the EU to provide a bailout package worth approximately 289 billion euros. This prevented Greece from defaulting and the chaos this would have caused for the European and global economy. So we've introduced a clear point. We're then explaining that point with the first institution and bring in specific knowledge and example to do so. We're then comparing it with bringing the other institution. The WTO also aims to promote economic stability and growth, so explaining how it's similar, by ensuring that global trade flows as predictably and freely as possible. It does so both facilitating trade negotiations so that countries reduce tariffs. For example, the Bali Trade Facilitation Agreement simplified global customs procedures, reducing trade costs by an estimated 14.3% on average. It also does so by settling disputes between countries to prevent destabilizing trade wars through the WTO's dispute settlement body. So, clear point of similarity, explain it for one institution and give some specific knowledge and example. Do the same for the other institution, explain how it's similar, and then you're done. You do that for 3 paragraphs effectively. To give you an example for it is a difference question. Examine the differences between shallow green ecology and deep green ecology. And just to say, we have detailed 12 marker plans for global on the website if you are looking for support with these. Again, you start by introducing a clear point of difference. An important difference between the beliefs of shallow green ecology and deep green ecology is that the former is anthropocentric while the latter is biocentric. Then we explain it for shallow green ecology. Shallow green ecology adopts an anthropocentric view, prioritizing human well-being and economic growth and seeking to tackle climate change within the context of these primary objectives. It is this perspective that has influenced national governments and the international community's efforts to tackle climate change without impeding economic growth. The European Union's emissions trading system exemplifies this approach. It caps greenhouse gas emissions, but allows companies to trade allowances using market incentives to reduce environmental impact. By contrast, using that comparative language, deep green ecology is biocentric and emphasizes the intrinsic value of the planet and environment, which must be protected irrespective of how useful they are to humanity. Deep green ecologists suggest that climate change and environmental degradation have been caused by human economic needs always being placed over the health of nature, and argue this must be flipped to meaningfully tackle climate change. For instance, the degrowth movement advocates for reducing consumption and shifting away from GDP growth as a measure of societal success. So there a clear difference, explaining it for the first ideology effectively and bringing in a specific example, then comparing it with the other and bringing in a specific example too. And we've got another example there. You can pause when you look at the recording, but it's kind of very similar effectively. And the final thing to have a look at is the analyze questions. So this will ask you, and you have to answer this one. It will ask you, you don't get a choice at all. It will ask you to compare the views of two schools of thought in international relations, normally realism and liberalism, on an issue or topic in global politics. And it's just AO1 and AO2 assessed. So it might be analyze the different explanations which realism and liberalism provide for recent developments since 2000, or analyze the differences between the realist concept of the security dilemma and the liberal concept of complex interdependence. And you could also get a question including the anarchical society and society of states theory. So most are just going to focus on realism and liberalism, and you're going to be comparing those on a particular point. But you could also get one on how this final theory differs from realism or liberalism. And the structure of this answer should be similar to your examine questions. You should aim for 3 paragraphs, and within each paragraph, first explain the key point of comparison, so difference or similarity. Make sure that it's specific to the topic of the question. Then explain how it's the case for the first theory. Make sure it's detailed enough and you explain why they think this. And sometimes you can bring in an example. You then want to explain how the other theory has a different view. Explain why and what they believe instead. And sometimes you'll bring in an example as well. And the crucial thing here is that for these analyze questions, you need to reference socialism, liberalism, or conservatism at least once in your answer, and once is enough. And normally this will be explaining how realism's view of international anarchy is based on Hobbes' conservative analysis of there being anarchy and conflict between individuals without a state, or explaining how liberalism's view that there can be effective cooperation between states is influenced by Locke's analysis of humans as rational and capable of cooperation. There's pretty much going to be one of those two every time, effectively. So to give you some examples, analyze the divisions that exist between realists and liberals in relation to order, security, and the likelihood of conflict. One key difference between realists and liberals on the international order is whether they see the international system as anarchic or rules-based. So a clear point in relation to the question. Then we start with realism. Central to realist thought is the idea that the international order is always in a condition of anarchy with no overarching global authority that can regulate the behaviour of states or enforce international rules. So we're explaining that realist view. We're actually then also bringing in the key thinker, the conservative thinker, to explain it, which I said you need to do once in the 12 marker. So this belief is influenced by conservative Thomas Hobbes' analysis that there is anarchy between individuals within each country if there is no state that can impose order through force. As there is no global governments as police force, realists similarly believe that in international politics, this leads to anarchy between states. Realists argue that the anarchic system without a global police force leads to a situation where the only body that can offer a state protection is the state itself. This leads to states being driven to maximise their own power to ensure their own security, whilst also leading them to be fearful of other states and viewing cooperating with skepticism. So we kind of introduced a clear point of disagreement. We then really explained it for the first theory for realism, including with reference to one of those core political ideas, Hobbes there. We then bring in, contrast it with liberalism. By contrast, liberals argue that the international system isn't completely defined by anarchy, with international laws and rules having significant influence on regulating behaviour of states. And then we explain that, including by bringing in Locke. You wouldn't have to do that here, because we've already brought in Hobbes. it can be a good way to do it, and really explaining it with relation to the international system. So it's very similar. Clear points of agreement or disagreement. Explain it for one ideology and really explain exactly what they think and why, including bringing in a specific example if it's relevant, and the liberalism or conservatism from the political ideas once throughout the 12 marker. Do the same for the other side of the argument. And then you just need to do that 3 times effectively. And just with this final one here, obviously you can kind of pause and have a look at the recording for some more specific examples. But if it's anarchical society and society of states, it you effectively it will be similar. You want the points to it will be a comparison. You want the points to be a comparison of that with one of realism or liberalism. So it's effectively the same structure. Okay, perfect. That I think is everything for the webinar. So I just want to point you back to the start just to let you know that we are running, or I am running, sorry, lots more webinars all the way up until the exams over Easter. And you can either join these live or purchase the recording afterwards. We're covering kind of every part of Edexcel and some key parts of AQA as well. And use the discount code webinar discount for 20% off either the Edexcel UK politics webinar or the AQA paper 1 webinar. But yeah, finishing off, any final questions from anyone before we finish?